Book 3, Chapter 101. An old nurse makes up a story of three princes for a boy. Rama said, "Tell me, O chief of sages, the story of the boy that illustrates the mind." Vasistha replied, "Hear me, Rama, tell you the tale of a silly and stupid boy, who once asked his nurse to recite some pretty story for his amusement. With a pleased face and with an accent sweet as honey, the nurse began to relate her fine wrought story for the pleasure of the boy. Once upon a time, in a desolate country, there were three high-minded and fortunate young princes, noted for their virtue and valor. They shone in that vast, desolate land, resembling the spacious sky like stars reflected in the expansive waters below. Two of them were unbegotten and uncreated, and the third was not born of a mother's womb. Once it had happened that these three went out together from their dreary abode to find a better place to live. They had no other companion with them, and they were sad in their minds and long faces as they were exiled from their native country. Having left that desert land, they set out with their faces looking forward and proceeded onward like the three planets Mercury, Venus, and Jupiter in their conjunction. Their bodies, delicate as serica flowers, were scorched by the powerful sun shining on their backs. On their way they were dried by the heat of the summer day, like wilted leaves on trees. Their lotus-like feet were singed by the burning sands of the desert path, and they cried aloud like some tender fawns straying from their herd, crying, "O Father, save us!" The soles of their feet were bruised by the blades of grass, and the joints of their body were weakened by the heat of the sun. Their fair forms were covered with dust flying from the ground on their lonely journey. They saw a clump of three trees by the wayside, braided with tufts of spikes upon them and loaded with fruit and flowers hanging down. They were a refuge for birds and desert animals resting about all around them. The first two of these trees did not grow wild, and the third, which was easy to climb, bore no seeds to produce other plants in the future. Under the shade of these trees the three princes were refreshed from the fatigue of their journey. They halted there like the three gods Indra, Vayu, and Yama under the thick shady branches of the Parijata trees of paradise. They ate the ambrosial fruit of them trees, they drank their nectar juice to fill, and after decorating themselves with gulunka garlands they resumed their journey. Having gone a long way, around midday they came to the confluence of three rivers flowing with rapid currents and swelling waves. One of these was a dry channel, and the other two were shallow with little water in them. They looked like the blind eyeballs of blind men. The princes, wet with perspiration, bathed joyfully in the almost dried-up channel, just like the three gods Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva washed their sweating limbs in the clear stream of the Ganges. They played along wild in the water and drank it, which was as sweet as milk, and cheered their spirits with full satisfaction of their hearts. They resumed their journey, and at the end of the day, about sunset, they arrived at their future home, a newly built city standing far away in the height of a hill. There were rows of flags fluttering like lotuses in the clear lake of the blue sky. The loud noise of the songs of the citizens were heard at a distance. Here they saw three beautiful and good-looking houses with turrets of gold and gems shining afar, like the peaks of Mount Meru under the blazing sun. Two of these were not the works of art, and the third was without foundation. At last the three princes entered the last of these. They entered this house and sat and walked about with happy faces. Inside they chanced upon three pots as bright as gold. The first two broke into pieces upon their lifting, and the third is reduced to dust as his touch. The far-sighted princes, however, took up the dust and made a new pot with it. It means that though these sheaths are as volatile as air, yet it is possible to employ the vital principle to action. Then these gluttonous princes used the pot to cook a large quantity of rice for their food, amounting to 100 bushels minus one, enough to live on for their whole lifetime. The princes then invited three Brahmins, childhood, youth, and age, to the food prepared by them, two of whom, childhood and youth, were bodiless, and the third, old age, had no mouth with which to eat. The mouthless Brahmin took 100 bushels of the rice and ate it up because he had devoured the child and the youth. The princes took the remainder of the Brahmin's food for their meal, which was nothing. The three princes, having refreshed themselves with a trace of the Brahmin's food, took their rest in the same house for the next home, then went on their journey to hunt for new homes or repeated reincarnations. Thus I have related to you, O Rama, the entire story of the boy and the princes. Now consider its significance well in your mind, and you will become wise thereby. After the nurse finished telling her pretty parable, the boy seemed happy with what he had heard. I have told you this story, O Rama, in connection with my lecture on the subject of the mind. The story serves to explain how the mind fabricates this imaginary being of the world. This air-built castle of the world with which has come to be taken for reality is like the story of the body, only a false fabrication from the old nurse's imagination. It is the representation of the various thoughts and ideas of our minds that exhibit themselves to view according to our notions of them in our states of bondage and liberation. Nothing really exists except the creation of our imagination. It is our fancy that fashions all the objects in their peculiar fantastic forms. The heavens, earth, sky, and air, and also the rivers, mountains, and the sides and quarters of the sky, are all creations of our fancy, like the vision in our dreams that join and disjoin the fashion scenes in their fantastic forms. Like the princes, the rivers, and the future city were mere creation of the nurse's imagination. In the same way, the existence of the visible world is only the product of man's imaginative power. Imaginative power manifests all things all around, like moving waters show the rise and fall of waves in the sea. It gives a shape of airy nothing. It is the power of apprehending ideas and combining them into new forms and combinations. The imaginative power of God raised the ideas of thing in his omniscient and all-comprehensive soul. These ideals afterwards manifested as real by his omnipotence, just like things lying in the dark are brought to view by daylight. Know from here on, O Rama, that the whole universe is a network of imagination, and your imagination is the most active power in the mind. Therefore, repress the thickening phantoms of your fleeing fancy and obtain your tranquility by relying solely upon the certainty of the immutable soul of souls. Book 3, Chapter 102, On the Indivisibility and Immortality of the Soul. Vasistha continued, The ignorant are subject to errors caused by their false fancies, from which the wise are entirely free. By imagining and attributing perishable properties to the imperishable soul, the ignorant beguile themselves like children who take their dolls to be men. Rama replied, What is this imagined perishable property that is imputed to the imperishable soul? Tell me also, O great of the theologians, what misrepresentation misleads the mind to the false conception of the unreal world for a reality? Vasistha replied, The soul, by its continued association with unreal and perishable things, thinks itself to be one of them, and takes the title of an unreal and perishable ego, just like a boy by association of his thoughts imagines a false apparition to be a real ghost. All things being situated in one absolute reality, it is hard to account for one's personal ego and to say how and from where this conception becomes established. In fact, there is no ego except that of the Supreme Soul. Yet it is the nature of the unwise to make a difference between a finite ego and infinite ego, and between a mortal and immortal soul, as if we see two streams of water in the sunbeams of a hot, sandy desert. The mind is a spacious mind of richest gems in this extensive creation, and depends on the Supreme Soul for its support, just like waves depend upon the waters of the sea for their rise in existence. Therefore, O Rama, give up your false views of the reality of the world and your reliance upon the baseless fabric of the universe. Rely with delight upon your judicious view of the true foundation and support of all. Inquire now into the nature of truth with a rational understanding. Being freed from all error and bias, discard all that is false and untrue. Why do you think that the unconfined soul is confined in the body? It is vain to suppose the infinite soul is confined in any place. To suppose one to be many is to make a division and create a variety in the nature of the Supreme Spirit. Again, the divine essence being diffused alike in all, it cannot be said to be confined in one thing and absent in another. The body being hurt, the soul is supposed to be hurt likewise, but no pain or hurt or sickness of any kind can affect the unchanging soul. The body being hurt or weakened or destroyed, there is no injury done to the soul. Just like a blacksmith's bellows being burned, the wind with which it is filled escapes unconsumed. Whether the body lasts or falls is of no matter to us. Like a flower being destroyed deposits its fragrance in the air. Let any pain or pleasure befall on the body like dewdrops falling on lotus leaves. It cannot affect us any more than a fading lotus affects or afflicts a flying being in any matter. Let the body rise or fall or fly and smoke and mix with the air. These changing forms can have no effect whatsoever on the soul. The connection of the body with the soul is like that between the cloud and the wind, and between the lotus and the bee. If the mind, that forms a part of all living bodies, is not affected by physical pain, then how it is possible that the primary power of consciousness that resides in the soul can be subject to death? If you know, O wise Rama, that the soul is indestructible and inseparable, then what is the need to have sorrow for the supposed separation or disappearance of all that pervading spirit? After the body is destroyed, the soul flies from it to live in the infinite space of empty air, like wind mixing with air after dispersing clouds, and a bee flying away after the lotus has faded away. The mind is not relaxed with all its enjoyments of life unless it is burnt down by the knowledge of truth. Then why speak of the annihilation of the soul? The connection between perishable body and imperishable soul is analogous to that of a vessel and the fruit it holds, and of a pot and the air in it. As a plum is held in the hand or it falls into a pit, so the empty soul is reposed in or disposed from the body. As a pot being broken, its empty part mixes with the air. So the body being dissolved, the soul remains unhurt in empty space. The minds and bodies of living beings are apt to disappear at times from where they live and hide under the shroud of death. Why should we sorrow for such renegades? Seeing the death and disappearance of others, no fool learns to think for himself, but fears to die like all ignorant fools. Therefore renounce, O Rama, your selfish desires, and know the falsity of ego. Give up the bond of the body and fly upward, like the new-fledged bird leaves its nest and flies above. It is an act of the mind to lead us to good or evil. It is another function of the mind to fabricate the false fabric of the world, like appearances in a dream. Our incorrigible ignorance stretches out these imaginaries only for our misery. Our imperfect knowledge shows these falsehoods as realities to us. The mind gives us a dim sight of things as we view the sky hidden by the mist. It is the nature of the mind to have a false view of objects. The dull and unreal world appears as a reality to us. The imaginary duration of the universe is like a protracted dream in our sleep. The thought or idea of the world is the cause of its physical existence, just as the blinking of the eye shows 1,000 disks of the sun and moon in a clear sky. Now, Rama, employ your reason to annihilate the physical world from your mind, just as the sun dissolves snow by the heat of its beams. As one wishing to overcome cold gets his object at sunrise, so he who wishes to demolish his mind succeeds at the rise of his reason. As ignorance increases, so it introduces a train of deep-seated errors and evils. It spreads a magic spell around it, just as Samvara, the sorcerer, showered a flux of gold dust about him. The mind by its worldliness makes the way to its own destruction, and acts the part of its own self-destructive catastrophe by all its acts. The mind wants only to preserve itself from destruction, but it is a fool who does not know its imminent death. The mind by its restless desire hastens itself to a painful death. The reasonable try to avoid restlessness by their government of the mind. The mind that is purified by reason is cleansed from its willingness and unwillingness, and resigns itself to the will of the divine soul, which is ever present before it. The curbing of the mind is the magnanimity of the soul, which gives rise to liberation from pain. Therefore, try to restrain your mind, and do not give it a loose rein. The world is a vast wilderness full of the forest of our well-being and sorrow, and beset on all sides by the serpents of disease and death. The irrational mind is as the rampant lord of the desert land, and quickly drives us all into all sorts of dangers and difficulty. Valmiki speaking. As the sage ended his sermon, the day departed to its end, and the sun declined to the west to his evening service. The assembly broke after mutual salutations and met again, and greeted each other with the parting night and the rising sun. Book 3, Chapter 103, The Changing Mind. Vasistha speaking. Some minds are seen to break forth into passion like the torrents of oceans, and to heave and overflow on earth on every side. They reduce the great to lowness, and exalt the low to greatness. They make strangers of their friends, and friends of strangers. The mind by its thought makes a mountain of a particle, then thinks itself a lord with its little trifle. The mind, elated by prosperity received by the will of God, spreads a large establishment for a while, then in a moment is reduced to poverty at its loss. Whatever things are seen in this world as stationary or changing are only accidents according to the perspective in which they are seen, just as a passing vessel is thought stationary by its passengers, but is moving by spectators on the shore. The mind is so changing by the influence of time, place, power, and nature of acts and things that it continually shuffles from one feeling to another, like an actor impersonating his many roles on the stage. The mind takes the truth for untruth, and its reverse for certainty, so it takes one thing for another, and its joy and grief are all of its own making. The fickle mind gets everything according to its own doing, and it regulates all the actions of our hands, feet, and other members of the body. Hence it is the mind that reaps the rewards of good or evil according to its past act, just like the tree bears its fruit according to how it is pruned and watered. As a child makes a variety of toy dolls from clay, so the mind is the maker of all its good and bad according to the merit or demerit of its past actions. Therefore the mind that is situated in the earthen dolls of human bodies can do nothing of its own will unless it is so destined by virtue of its former acts. As the seasons cause change in trees, so the mind makes differences in the disposition of living beings. The mind indulges in its sport of deeming an inch for a mile, and vice versa of thinking something long is short, like the operations of our dreams and fancy. A kalpa age is shortened to a moment, and a moment is stretched into a kalpa by different modes of the mind that regulate both the duration of time and the distance between places. The perceptions of the quickness and slowness of motion, and of much or little in quantity, and also of swiftness or slowness of time, belong to the mind and not to the dull material body. The feelings of sickness and error, sorrow and danger, and the passing of time and distance of place all rise in the mind like the leaves and branches of a tree. The mind is the cause of all its feeling, just as water is the cause of sea and the heat of fire. Hence the mind is the source of all things. It is intimately connected with whatever exists in the world. The thoughts that we have of agent, effect, and instrument of things, and also of the viewer, view, and the instrumentality of sight, all belong to the mind. The mind alone is perceived to be in existence and in the world, and its representation of force and all other things are but variations of itself. So the thinking man sees only the substance of gold, and all its various forms of bangles and bracelets are taken for nothing. Book 3, Chapter 104, A Magician, a Horse, and a Stunned King Lavana. Vasistha said, Rama, hear me relate a very pretty story about the world as an enchanted city stretched out by magic of the magician mind. There lies on the surface of this earth a large and populous tract of land by name of northern Pandava, a country full of forests of various kinds. The forests were deep and dense, and a number of holy hermits lived in the vastness of the forest. Vidyahara maidens had constructed many dwellings of swinging vines. The breeze blew up heaps of red dust from full-blown lotuses, rising as high as crimson hills on the ground decorated with wreaths and garlands from loads of flowers fallen from surrounding trees. Groves of karanja plants were decorated with bundles of blossoms to the farthest boundaries of the jungle, and the sky resounded with the rustling noise of leafy date trees in the surrounding villages. There was a range of tawny rocks on one side, and fields brown with ripened grain on another, while a warbling of cerulean doves echoed in the resonant groves. The shrill cry of the stork sounded in the forest, and the branches of spice and patali flowers hang down like earring on the hill. Flocks of various birds made a chorus with their cries, and blooming crimson blossoms of pardahadra trees hung over the banks all along the length of the running streams. Maidens in the cornfields were exciting the passion of love with their singing. Breezes, blowing amidst forests of fruit and flowers, dropped down the blossoms in copious showers. Birds, spiritual masters, and seers were sitting and singing outside their homes, made in mountainous caves, making the valley symphonious with their celestial strains of holy hymns. Kanara and Gandharva choruses were singing under their bowers of plantain trees, and the grayish and gay groves of flowers were filled with the hum of the whistling breeze. The lord of this romantic country was the virtuous Lavana, a descendant of King Harash Chandra, and as glorious as his sire the sun upon earth. His fair fame formed a white diadem to crown his head, and adorn his shoulders with its brightness. It whitened the hills in the form of so many Shivas, smeared with white ash upon his tufted head and person. His sword had made an end of all his enemies, who trembled as in a fit of fever on hearing his noble name. His greatest effort was devoted to support respectful men, and his name was uttered like that of Hari Vishnu by all his people. The Apsara fairies sitting in the celestial seats of the gods on the top of the Himalaya mountains gleefully sang songs of his praise. The Lord of the Skies heard the songs of the heavenly maids, and the aerial swans and cranes of Brahma responded to the praise with their gabbling cries. His uncommonly magnanimous and wonderful acts, free from the fault of being stingy, were unlike anything that was ever heard or seen by anyone. His nature knew no guile, and he was a perfect stranger to pride and arrogance. He kept himself steadfast to his magnanimity, as Brahma held himself fast to his Rudraksha beads. He used to take his seat in the royal throne amidst his courtiers, as the Lord of the day occupies his seat in the sky for the 8 watches of the day. After he was seated there as happily as the moon in the sky, his chieftains and legions appeared before the throne with their salutations. Then, as the royal party was seated in the court hall, beautiful singers began to sing and ravish the hearts of listeners with the music of lutes. Then a set of handsome maids waved the beautiful fans that they had held in their hands over the body of the king. Ministers and counselors, as wise as the teachers of the gods and demons, Brihaspati and Shukra, took their seats beside him. Ministers engaged in the public affairs pending before them, and capable officers reported to the king on the condition of the country. There were learned pundits reciting holy legends from their books, and courtiers, eulogists, chanting their sacred praises on one side. At this time a magician appeared before the court in his fantastic attire. He boasted and blustered like a roaring cloud, threatening to flood the earth with showers of rain. He bowed down to the rulers of earth, and lowly bent his capped head and neck before the court, like a tree hangs down its load of fruit at the foot of a mountain. He approached the king like a monkey advances to a shady and lofty tree loaded with fruit and flower. Then the cunning trickster conveyed the fragrance of his scents with the breath of his mouth. He addressed the lofty-headed king with a sweet voice, as a humble bumblebee hums to the lotus. Allow, O Lord, who sits on the earthly throne, like the moon enthroned on high, to mark one wonderful feat of my art, known as the trick of Karlika. Saying so, he began to twirl his magic staff, set with peacock feathers, which began to display many wonders like the wonderful works of creation. The king saw it describing a bright circle emanating particles of the rays around it. He saw it like god Indra sees his variegated rainbow sparkling afar in the sky. At this time a chieftain of Sind entered the court, like a cloud appears in the starry heaven. He was followed by a swift and beautiful war-horse, just like Uchadravas, the seven-headed horse of Indra, follows his master in the celestial regions. The chieftain brought the horse before the king and said, "My lord, this horse is a match for Uchasarvas, who is produced by the milky ocean and flies with the swiftness of the mind. This horse of mine, O king of the earth, is the best of his kind and an equal of Uchasarvas. He is a personification of the wind and the swiftness of his flight. My master has made a present of this horse to you, my lord, because the best thing is a suitable present to the best of men." After the chief ended his speech, the magician spoke in a voice as sweet as that of the swallow after the roaring of clouds is hushed by silence. "My lord, ride upon this horse and wander at your pleasure with full luster on earth, as the sun shines forth in splendor by revolving around the heavens." Hearing this, the king looked at the horse, and in a voice like that of a peacock answering a roaring cloud, ordered the horse to be brought before him. The king saw the horse like a figure drawn in painting, and gazed upon him with fixed eyes and without closing his eyelids, as if the king himself had been turned into a painting. Having looked upon the horse for a long time, he mounted on his back, and sat still with his closed eyelids, as sage Agastya was confounded at the sight of the sea and its rocks. He continued for a couple of hours as if he was drowned in his meditation, and as unconscious saints remain in the enjoyment of their internal and spiritual samadhi. He remained spellbound and overpowered by his own might. None could rouse the king roused from a stupefaction. He remained absorbed in some thoughts of his own mind. Flapping fans ceased to wave about his body, and the holders of the fans remained as still as moonbeams at night. Courtiers remained motionless at seeing his stillness, as when the filaments of the lotus remain unmoved when smeared in the mud. The noise of people in the courtyard became hushed and quiet, like the roaring of the clouds stop at the end of the rain. Ministers were drowned in their thoughtfulness and questions of the state of the king, just like the host of gods was filled with anxiety on seeing the club bearing Vishnu fighting with the demons. People were struck with terror and dismay at seeing this paralysis of the king, who remained with his eyes closed, like closed lotuses shorn of their beauty. Book 3, Chapter 105. The magic spell on King Lavana is broken. Vasistha continued. After a couple of hours, the king returned to his senses, like the lotus flower resuming its beauty after the midst of the rainy weather are over. He shook his body decorated with ornaments upon his saddle, like a mountain shakes with its peaks in woods at an earthquake. His seat also shook under him as he came to his senses and moved his body, just like the seat of Shiva on Kailash mountain is shaken by the movement of the world-supporting elephant. As he was about to fall down from his horse, he was held up by the arms of his attendants, like Mount Meru is kept from falling by the hills at its feet and side. Attendants bore the king in the deranged state of his mind, like the still waters of the sea bear the figure of the moon that is disturbed by the waves. The king softly asked them, "Where am I, and whose court is this?" He was like a bee shut up in the flower cup of the lotus and about to sink in the water, saying, "Ah, where am I, and where am I going?" The courtiers, with a voice as sweet as the lotus uttering to the sun when he is eclipsed by Rahu, respectfully asked the king what was the matter with him. The attendants and all the ministerial officers asked him what had happened, like the gods terrified at the great flood asked sage Markandeya about what had happened. "Lord, we were greatly dismayed," said they, "upon seeing you in that plight, because the stoutest hearts are broken by accidents proceeding from unknown causes. What were these pleasant objects of your desire that had so bewitched your mind? You know that all objects that appear pleasant for the present prove to be bitter at the end. How could your clear understanding, which has been pacified by the grand doctrines and precepts of the wise, fall into the false fascination of the foolish? The minds of fools are fascinated by the trivial and cheap trifles of common people, but they are of no value to the high-minded as one like yourself. Those who are elated by the pride of their bodies have their minds always excited by uncontrollable passions that take their lead through life. Your mind is elevated above common things. It is calm and quiet, enlightened by truth, and filled with excellent qualities. Yet it is strange to find it out of its wits. The mind unpracticed to reason is led away by the currents of time and place, but the noble-minded are not subject to the influence of incantations and enchanting spells. It is impossible for the reasoning mind to be weakened or arranged. A high mind, like towering Mount Meru, is not to be shaken by the boisterous winds. Thus consoled by his companions, the king's face resumed its color, as the face of the full moon collects its brightness in the bright fortnight of the moon. The moonlight face of the king was brightened by his full open eyes, as the spring season is beautified by blooming blossoms after the winter frost has passed away. The king's face shone forth with astonishment, and it was mixed with fear, upon remembering the charm of the magician, just like the moon shines pale in the sky after a deliverance from the shadow of an eclipse. He saw the magician and said to him with a smile, as the serpent Takshaka addresses his enemy, the weasel, "You trickster," said the king, "what was this snare that you used to trap me? How did you disturb my tranquil soul by your wily trick, like a gale disturbs the calm of the sea? How wonderful are the captivating powers of spells derived from the Lord, whose influence has overpowered the strongest sense of my mind. What are these bodies of men that are subject to death and disease, and what are our minds that are so susceptible of error and lead us to continued danger? The mind residing in the body may be filled with the highest knowledge, yet the minds of the wisest of men are liable to error and illusion. Hear, ye courtiers, the wonderful tale of the adventures that I experienced under the sorcery from the moment I first met this magician. I have seen as many passing scenes in one single moment under this wizard as had been shown of old by Brahma in his destruction of the divine sorcery of Indra." Having said so, the king smiled and began to relate to his courtiers the strange wonders that he had seen in a state of hallucination. The king said, "I saw a region full of objects of various kinds, such as rivers, lakes, cities, and mountains, with many boundary hills and the ocean surrounding the earth." Book 3, Chapter 106. King Lavana marries a tribal maiden. The king related, "My own land, abounding in forest and rivulets, appeared like a miniature on this planet Earth. This land of which I am king, and where I am now sitting in my royal assembly hall, amidst my courtiers and all these citizens, appeared like the paradise of Indra. That sorcerer appeared here from a distant country, like a demon rising from the infernal region to the surface of the ground. He whirled his magic wand, emanating its radiance abound, like the tempest rends and scatters the rainbow of Indra in fragments in the air. I was looking intently at the whirling wand and the horse standing before me, then mounted on the back of the steed in the dizziness of my mind. I sat on the back of this unmoving horse and seemed to ride on a fleet horse with the swiftness of Pushkara and Avtaka clouds riding over the tops of immovable rocks. Then I went on a chase at full speed, passing over an ownerless desert, howling like the surges of the boundless ocean. The horse bore me through the air as if we were blown by the wind. We dashed onward like common people who are carried afar by the currents of the unsatisfied desires of their mind. Then, being fatigued with my journey and moving slowly on my wearied horse, I reached the edge of a desert which was as vacant as the mind of a pauper and as empty as the heart of a woman. It was like the wilderness of the world burned down by a conflagration, without even a bird flying over it. It was like a waste of sandy frost without a tree or any water in it. In its extent it appeared like another sky, or like an eighth ocean of the world. It was like a sea on earth with its bed entirely dried up. It was expanded as the mind of a wise man, and as furious as the rage of the ignorant. There was no trace of human feet, and no track with any grass or herb in it. My mind was bewildered in this boundless desert. like that of a woman fallen in adversity and having no friend, food, or fruit for her support. The face of the sky was washed by water appearing in the mirage of the sandy desert. I traveled panting in that dreary spot until it was sunset. It was with great pain and sorrow that I crossed that vast desert, like a wise man who crosses this world all hollow and void within. After passing this desert, and as the sun was setting, I reached a thick forest, tired with traversing through the hollow sphere of heaven. Here birds were warbling amidst jam and kadama trees. They were the only friends the weary travelers could meet in their weary and lonely journey. Here detached plots of long grass were seen waving like tops, like covetous men nodding their heads on finding some riches to their heart's content. This shady forest afforded me a little joy after my pain in the dry and dreary desert, just like a lingering disease seems more desirable to men than the pain attending death. I got under the shade of the jambira tree and felt myself as pleased as when sage Markandeya got to the top of the mountain during the great deluge. I took shelter under the vines descending from its branches, just as the scorching top of the mountain finds temporary shade under a dark cloud. As I was holding the hanging roots in my hand, the horse slid away from underneath me, like the sins of man glide under him who puts his trust in the sacred Ganges River. Fatigued with my travel a long day through the dreary waste, I took refuge under this tree like a traveler rests under the shelter of a kalpa tree at the setting of the sun. All this business of the world was stopped as the sun went down to rest in the western hill. As the shade of night spread over the bosom of the universe, the entire forest below took itself to its nightly rest in silence. I rested in the grassy hollow of a branch of that tree, my head on a mossy bed like a bird in a nest. I remained there as unconscious as one bitten by a snake, and like a dead body that had lost its past memory. I was as impotent as a sold slave and as helpless as one fallen in a dark pit. That one night I passed in my senselessness seemed like a long kalpa eon. I thought I was buffeting in waves like sage Markandeya at the great deluge. I passed the night under a train of dangers and difficulties that invaded me as in a state of dreaming. I had no thought about bathing or eating or worshipping my Maker. I passed the night in restlessness and disquiet, shaking like the branch of a tree. This single night of trouble was as long as it was tedious to me. A melancholy spread over my face, as darkness veils the face of the night. My waking eyes kept watching for the day, like the watchful eyes of blue lotuses expect the rising moon. The demonic noise of wild beasts hushed in the forest at the end of the night. I began to shiver from the cold, my teeth clattering. Then I saw the east red with a flush of intoxication, as if it was laughing at seeing me drown in my difficulty. I saw the sun advancing towards the earth, mounted on his Arvata, the regent elephant of that quarter. He seemed as full of glee as an ignorant man has in his folly, and as a poor man in obtaining a treasure. I got up from my mossy bed and shook off my bedcloth like Shiva toffing off his elephant hide during his giddy evening dance. Then I began to wander in the wide forest, just as god Rudra, Shiva, roves about the wide world after its desolation by his demons at the end of the kalpas. There were no animal or any kind to be seen in the desolate desert, just as the good qualities of good breeding are never found in the illiterate. I saw only lively birds perched and chirping all about the woods without intermission. It was midday, when the sun had run its 8th hour, and plants had dried up the dew of their morning bath, when I saw a maiden carrying some food and a drinking bowl of water, just as Hari Vishnu in his disguise in the shape of Mandavi bore the poisonous liquor to the demons. She was of a swarthy complexion and dressed in dark black clothing. When I advanced towards her like the bright moon appears towards the black and dark night, she looked at me suspiciously. I asked her to give me some of her food in my great distress, because I told her one is enriched by relieving the distress of the needy. "O good maid," I said, increasing hunger is consuming my stomach, as I would take any food, even as the female serpent in extreme hunger devours her own young. Begged of her, and yet she gave me nothing, but remained as unmoved as the goddess of fortune, who declines to favor the wretched however much they implore her aid. For a long time I kept following her closely from one wood to another, moving behind her in the afternoon and clinging to her like her own shadow. Then she turned to me and said, "Know me to be a tribal, an outcast girl bearing the name of Haruyiri. We are as cruel as Rakshasa demons. We feed on human flesh and the meat of horses and elephants. O king, you cannot get your food simply by begging me for it, as it is hard to have the favor of men without first meeting their own desires." Saying so, she continued moving with quick, light steps at every move, then entered a grove of trees on the wayside. Then she spoke merrily to me, saying, "Well, I will give you some of the food if you will agree to be my husband, because base and common people do not do good to others before securing their own good. My tribal father is here plowing in the field with a sturdy yoke of bulls. With his haggard, hungry, and dusty stature, he looks like a demon standing in the cemetery. This food is for him. I may give it to you if you agree to marry me, because the husband deserves to be served even at the peril of one's life." To this I replied, "I agree to take you as my wife, for what fool would adhere to his family customs when his life is in danger?" Then she gave me half of the food she had with her, as Mandavi parted with half of her ambrosia to the hungry Indra of old. I ate the tribal's food and drank the beverage of jamba fruit that she gave me. Then I rested at that place and fell into a sleep caused by my fatigue and long walking. Then she approached me like a black cloud approaches the sun. She held me in her arms and led me onward with her guiding hand as fondly as her second self. She took me to her father, a fat and ugly fellow of repulsive appearance, like the tormenting agony of death leads a person to the hideous cell of the devil. My companion whispered the news of our situation to his ears. Like a black bee hums her tail softly to the ear of an elephant. "This man," she said, "is to be my husband if you, my father, will give your consent." To this he expressed his approval by saying, "Vadham, be it so by the end of this day." He loosened the bulls from their yoke, as the Lord of Death releases his hellhounds. It was dusk when the sty was hidden by evening mist, and the dust rising as the herd returns, and we were dismissed by the demon's presence to make our own way. We passed the great jungle in a short time and reached the tribal's house in the evening, just like demons pass through a cemetery to rest in their funeral vaults at night. One side of the house had slaughtered monkeys, cocks, and crows, swarms of flies flying over them and sucking the blood sprinkled over the ground. Moist entrails and arteries of slaughtered beasts were hung up to be dried in the sun and chased by ravenous birds hovering over them. Flocks of birds fluttered over jambira trees. Heaps of fat were laid up to be dried in the portico, ravenous birds flying over them. The skins of slain animals smeared with blood lay in piles. Little children had bits of flesh in their hands, beset by buzzing flies, and older tribals sat and rebuked the children. Then we entered the house scattered with disgusting entrails and intestines. I thought I was like the ghost of a dead man standing beside the Lord of Death. I was offered a seat of a big plantain leaf, given with due respect, so that I might be seated as a welcome guest in the abominable abode of a newly earned father-in-law. My squint-eyed mother-in-law then eyed me with her blood-red eyeballs and muttered with gladness in her look, "Is this our would-be son-in-law?" Afterwards we sat on some seats made of skin, and I partook of a meal served to me as a reward for my sins. I heard many of those endearing words that are the seeds of endless misery, and many speeches that were unpleasant to my mind because they were of no benefit to me. One day afterward, when the sky was cloudless and the stars were shining, it came to pass that they presented a dowry of cloth and other articles before me. With this they gave that frightful maiden to me, and we were joined together as black and white, and as sin and its torment together. The flesh-eating tribals celebrated the marriage ceremony with a profusion of wine and loud shouts of joy. They beat their noisy drums with merriment, as wicked men delight in carrying on the acts of their vileness. Book 3, Chapter 107, Life Among the Tribals. The king continued, "What more shall I say of these festivities that had quite subdued my soul? From then on my fellows called me Pushta, Pukusha, or Cherished Tribal. After a week-long celebration, and after I had spent a full 8 months at that place, my wife discharged blood, and then her child also. She delivered a daughter which is the cause of sorrow, as danger is the spring of disaster. This daughter grew up as quickly as the cares and sorrows of the ignorant. In another 3 years she again brought forth, this time a black boy, just like the fruit of folly, raises false expectations of fruition. She gave birth to another daughter, then another boy, and thus I became an old tribal with a large family in that forest land. In this manner many years passed in that place with these shoots of my sorrow, like one who murders Brahman has to pass long years of torment and hellfire. I had to undergo all the pains of heat and cold and chill winds and frost without any help in that dreary forest. Like an old tortoise is constrained to move about in the mud of a pool forever. Being burdened with the cares of my family and troubled by anxieties of my mind, I saw my increasing afflictions like a fire burning all around me. Clad in bark and wrapped in old and ragged clothes, with a covering of grass and a straw hat on my head, I bore loads of logs from the woods, like we bear the burden of sins on our back and heads. I had to pass many a long year under the shade of a Diwali trees, which no other cloth or covering on me than an old tattered, dirty, and stinky kapina loincloth beset by fleas and leeches. I was exposed to chill cold winds during all my toils to support my family. I lay like a frog in some cave in the woods under the sharp blast of winter. The many quarrels, bickering, sorrows, and wailing to which I was often exposed at home and abroad made my blood gush out in tears from my weeping eyes. We passed nights on marshy grounds in the jungle, and being drenched by raining clouds, we took shelter in mountainous caves with no food other than the roasted flesh of bears. After the rainy season of sowing was over, and the dark, dazzling clouds dispersed, I was driven from my house by the unkindness of my relations and continued quarreling with others. Being thus in dread of everyone in the neighborhood, I moved to the house of another man, where I lived with my wife and prattling children for many years. Then, vexed by the scolding of the quarrelsome tribal woman and the threats of the villainous tribals, my face became as pale as the waning moon under the shadow of Rahu. My wife bit and scratched me as if a tigress had torn a knot upon my flesh and muscles. I was like a slave caught and sold to a hellish fiend. I thought that I had become changed into an infernal being. I suffered under the torrents of snow thrown out of the caves of the Himalayas. I was exposed to showers of frost that fell continually in the dewy season. I felt the iron shafts of rain on my naked body, like arrows fired from the bow of death. In my sickly and decrepit old age, I had to live upon the roots of withered vegetables. I dug them out plentiful from the woodland grounds and ate them with zest, like a fortunate man has tasting his dainty dishes of well-cooked meat. I took my food apart and untouched by anybody for fear of being polluted by the touch of a vile and base-born family, and because of the pungency of my unsavory diet made my mouth scowl at every morsel. While I was famishing in this manner, I saw others eating animal flesh and sheep's flesh brought by their places, and who pampered their bodies with the flesh they cut out from other living animals, and devoured raw with great zest. They bought animal flesh, sold in iron pots, and stuck in spits, earning rebirth into as many as 1,000 bodies as they had killed and fed upon. I often went with my spade and basket in the cool of the evening to the tribal's gardens in order to collect the raw flesh that had been cast in the dirt for my food of them. But when I was about to be cast into hell, time seemed to turn favorably by leading me to take refuge in mountain caves to seek my food there from the roots and plants growing there. In this state, and by my good luck, I met some tribals driving away village dogs with their clubs. They gave my wife and children some bad rice like the villagers used to take, and we passed the night under the shade of a palm tree whose withered leaves rattled with the raindrops that fell in showers upon them. We passed the night in company with these woodland apes, our teeth clattering with cold and the hairs of our body standing on our ends from the cold like 1,000 thorns. Raindrops decorated our bodies like granules of vivid pearls. From our hunger and lack of food, our bellies were as lean and lank as an empty cloud. Then my wife and I began to quarrel in this dreadful forest. We kept shouting at each other with our clattering teeth and eyes ruddy from the cold. My foul and dirty body resembled that of a dark black demon, and we roved about the borders of rivers and brooks to fish with a rod and hook in my hand. I also wandered with a trap in my hand like Yama with its noose at the desolation of the earth, and caught, killed, and drank the heart-blood of deer in my hunger and thirst. I sucked the warm heart-blood like milk from my mother's breast. Smeared in blood, I stood like a blood-sucking demon in a cemetery. The Vatala ghosts of the woods fled before me, as they do from the furies of the forest. I set my snares and nets in the woods for catching deer and birds of the air. As people spread the nets of their wives and children only to be entangled in them in the false hope of happiness, so did I spread my net of thread to beguile the birds for their destruction. Though worried and worn out in the nets of worldly cares and surrounded on every side by the miseries of our vicious life, yet our minds still take delight in cruel and foul acts to the injury of others. Our wishes are stretched as far and wide as a running river overflows its bank in a rainy season, but the object of our desires fly far away from us. Like snakes, through their own wisdom, hide themselves from the snake-eating weasel. We have cast kindness off from our hearts like the snake leaves off his skin, and take delight letting the hissing arrows of our malice fly, just as a thunderstorm falls on all animals. Men delight at the sight of cooling clouds at the end of a hot season, but they avoid at a distance the rough, briny shore spread wide before them. I underwent many difficulties that multiplied as thickly upon me as weeds growing in the valleys. During my destined time I moved about all corners of the hellish spot. I have sown the seeds of sin under the rainwater of my ignorance to grow speedily as thorns on my way. I have laid hidden snares for the unwary innocents to bind myself in the mountain caves. I have caught and killed innocent deer in traps to feed upon its flesh. I have killed the fly-whisked cow to lay my head on the hair hanging down their necks. I slept unconscious of myself and my ignorance, as Vishnu lay on his huge hydra. I laid with my outstretched legs and limbs in a brown cell, resounding to the yell of wild beasts outside. I also laid my body on the frost of the cave in the marshy ground of Vindhya, and wrapped my swarthy form in a tattered gilt full of fleas and hanging down my neck. I bore it on my back as a bear carries the long bristles upon the evening in the hot season. I suffered the heat of wildfires that burned many wild animals that perished in groups, like in the last conflagration of the world. My wife bore her young ones, both for our pleasure as well as pain, like a glutton's food serves both as gratification and sickness, and like the influence of planets is for both our good and evil. Thus I, the only son of a king, had to pass 60 painful years of my life, as so many kalpa ages of long duration. I raved sometimes in my rage, and wept at others in my bitter grief. I lived on coarse meal, and dwelt alas in the house of vulgar tribals. Thus I passed so many years of my misery at that place, as one fastened to the chains of his insatiable desires, doomed to toil and moil for nothing until his death. Book 3, Chapter 108. King Lavana's Description of Drought and Wildfire. The king continued to say, Time passed away, old age overtook me, and turned my beard to blades of grass covered with white frost. My days passed away in alternate joy and grief, brought on by my fate and act, just like the river flows with green and dried leaves scattered in it by the wind. Every moment I suffered quarrels and arguments, misfortunes and bad luck. They beset me as thick and as fast as the arrows of sorrow flying in the battle. My foolish mind kept fluttering like a bird in the maze of my wishes and fancies. My heart was disturbed by passions like the sea by its raging waves. My soul was revolving on the vehicle of my wandering thoughts. I was carried away by them like floating straw to the whirlpool of the eventual ocean of time. I, who moved about like a worm in the woodlands of India for my simple support, fell in the passing of years to be weakened and pulled down in my frame like a two-legged beast of burden. In that state of my wretchedness, I forgot my royalty like a dead man and became convinced that I was a tribal bound to that hilly spot like a wingless bird. The world appeared to me like a final desolation, a forest consumed by fire. It seemed like the seashore lashed by huge waves or the withered tree struck by lightning. The marshy ground in the foot of the Vindhya was all dried up and left no grain, vegetable, or water for food or drink. The whole group of tribals was about to die in dearth and dryness. Clouds ceased to rain and disappeared from sight. Winds blew with sparks of fire in them. Forest trees were bare and leafless, and withered trees were strewn on the ground. Wildfires were raging here and there, and the woodlands became as desolate as the homes of austere ascetics. There followed a severe famine, and a furious wildfire spread all around. It burnt down the whole forest and reduced grass and gravel to ashes. People had ash all over their bodies and were starving for want of food and drink. The land was without any article of food or even grass or water. It had turned into a dreary desert. The mirage of the desert glistened like water and deluded dry buffaloes to roll in it. There was no current of breeze to cool the desert air. Only calls and cries for water came to the ears of men who were parched under the burning rays of the torrid sun. The hungry mob, hurrying to browse upon branches and herbs, yielded their lives in these acts, while others sharpened their teeth, tearing and devouring one another. Some ran to bite the gum of Katucha, thinking it to be a bit of flesh. Others swallowed stones as if they were cakes lying on the ground before them. The ground was sprinkled from blood, with men biting and tearing each other, like blood profusely spilled when a lion kills a big and starving animal. Every one was as ferocious as a lion in his attempt to devour another as his prey. Men fought each other like wrestlers in a contest. Trees were leafless, and hot winds blew like firebrands on all sides. Wild cats licked human blood spilled on the rocky ground. The wildfire flames rose high in the air with clouds of smoke whirling with the howling winds of the forest. It growled aloud everywhere and filled the forest land with heaps of brown cinders and burning firebrand. Huge serpents were burnt in their caves, and the fumes rising from these burning bodies served to grow poisonous plants, with the flames streaming aloft with the winds gave the sky an appearance of the glory of the setting sun. Strong, howling winds raised heaps of ashes like dust that stood like domes in the sky, unsupported by pillars. Little children stood by their weeping parents, crying for fear of them. There were some men who tore a dead body with their teeth, and in their great haste to devour the flesh, bit their own hands and fingers that were covered with their own blood. Vultures flying in the air darted upon the smoke, thinking it a turret of trees, and pounced upon the firebrands, taking them for bits of raw flesh. Men biting and tearing one another were flying in all directions with the splitting of burning wood, hit their breasts and bellies and made them gory with blood gushing out of them. Winds were howling in hollow caves, and the flames of the wildfire flashed with fury. Snakes were hissing for fear of these, and the burned woods were falling down with hideous noise. Thus beset by dangers and horrors, with no shelter other than the rugged hollows of rocks, this place presented a picture of this world with its encompassing flames burning like the 12 zodiacal signs on high. Winds blowing hot in the burning woods and rocks dried up everything. The heat of the fire below and the sun above, together with the domestic disasters caused by influence of the planet Saturn, made this place a counterpart of this sorrowful world. Book 3, Chapter 109, Migration of the Tribals, Mind Creates All. The king continued, as the displeasure of destiny continued these disasters to rage in this place, prematurely overtaking the forest and people with the disaster of the last disillusion, some of these men with their wives and children went out from the place in search of some new place to live in foreign lands. Like clouds disperse and disappear from the sky after the rainy season is over. Wives, children, close relatives accompanied them, clinging like the members of their body, but the lean and infirm were left behind like branches broken from trees. Some of these immigrants were devoured by tigers as they went out of their homes, like hatchling birds or caught by falcons as they come out of their nests. Some entered into the fire like moths to put an end to their miserable lives. Others fell into pits like fragments of rocks falling from the hills. I separated from the connections of my father-in-law and others, and depending upon myself, I escaped narrowly from that distressed country with my wife and children. We passed pitfalls, storms, wild beasts, and snake without any harm. We came out of that forest safe from all the deadly perils along the way. Arriving at the edge of the forest, we got under the shade of some palm trees, where I let my children down from my shoulders as burden of my sin and sorrow. I halted here after my tiring journey and length and trouble, like one who had fled from the confines of hell. I took my rest like the withering lotus from the scorching sunbeams and heat of summer. My tribal wife also slept under the same tree, and my 2 children lay fast asleep in each other's embrace under the cooling shade. Afterwards, my younger son, Prakjata, who was as dear to us as he was less intelligent, rose up and stood before me. He said with a depressed spirit and tears gushing out of his eyes, "Father, give me some more meat food and drink, or else I die." The little boy repeatedly made the same request, saying with tears in his eyes that he was dying of hunger. I told him that I had no meat, and the more I said so, the more he repeated his foolish craving, which could neither be supplied with nor be put down to silence. I was then moved by paternal affection and affliction of my heart to tell him, "Child, cut off a slice of my flesh and roast and eat it." He agreed to it and then said, "Give it then." His hunger was so pressing and his vitality so exhausted that he could not decline to crave my flesh for his food. Being then overpowered by affection and compassion, I thought of putting an end to all my grief with my life, which had become so intolerable to me at this extreme distress. Being unable to endure the pain of my affection, I despaired of my own life, and resolved to resort to death as my only friend at this last extreme. I collected some wood and heaped them together for my funeral pile. Having put it on fire, I saw it blazing as I wished. As I was hurrying to throw myself on this burning pile, I suddenly was roused by my reverie by the sound of music proceeding from this palace, hailing me as king and shouting, "Jaya," for my victory. I understood this conjurer had wrought this enchantment on me, and put me to all this imaginable trouble for so long a period. Like the ignorant, I was subject to 100 changes of fortune. Vasistha speaking. As the great and mighty King Lavana was describing his fluctuations of fortune, the sorcerer suddenly disappeared from sight. The courtiers looked around with staring eyes and addressed the king, saying, "O loyal lord, this man was no sorcerer with his own mercenary views. It was divine magic showing to our Lord to demonstrate the lot of humanity and the state of the world. Evidently this world is a creation of the mind, and the imaginary world is only a display of the infinite power of the Almighty. These hundreds of worldly systems display the various powers of omnipotence that delude even the minds of the most wise to believe in the reality of unrealities, as it were by the spell of magic. This delusion being so powerful in the mind of the wise, it is no wonder that our king would be overpowered when all common minds are laboring under the same error. This delusive mind was not spread over the mind by any trick or art of a conjurer who wanted nothing more than his own gain. They who love money never go away by themselves without getting something. Therefore we are tossed on the waves of doubt to take him for a sorcerer." Vasistha said, "Rama, though I am sitting here at this moment before you and others of this assembly, yet I am quite aware of the truth of this story. It is no fiction like the tale for the boy I told you before, nor is it any invention or hearsay of mine. Thus the mind is enlarged by the various inventions of its imagination, just as a tree is extended by the expansion of its bough and branches. The extended mind encompasses all things, like an outstretched tree spreads over the ground. The mind's comprehension of everything and its familiarity with the nature of all things serves to lead it to its state of perfection. Book 3, Chapter 110. Description of the mind's play. Vasistha said, in the beginning, the subjective consciousness, chit, derived the power of knowing objective phenomena, chityas, from the Supreme Cause. Then it went on to multiply and diversify the objects of its own intelligence, and thus fell from the knowledge of the one intelligent, universal ego, to the delusion of particular non-egos without end. Thus Rama, the faculties of the mind, being deluded by the unrealities of particulars and to their utter error, continue to attribute specialty and differences to the general ones. Mental powers are ever busy multiplying unrealities to infinity, just as ignorant children are prone to create false demons of their fancy only for their own terror and trouble. But reality soon disperses troublesome unrealities, and unsullied understanding drives off the errors of imagination as sunshine dispels the darkness. The mind brings distant objects near it and throws the nearest ones at a distance. It trots and flutters in living beings like children leaping and jumping in bushes after little birds. The wistful mind is fearful when there is nothing to fear. Like a frightened traveler takes the stump of a tree for a demon standing on his way. The suspicious mind suspects a friend for a foe. Like a drunken sot thinks himself lying on the ground while he is walking along. The distracted mind sees fiery Saturn in the cooling moon, and nectar being swallowed as a poison acts as poison itself. The building of a castle in the air, however, untrue, is taken for truth for the time being. The mind dwelling on hopes is a dreamer in its waking state. The disease of desire is a delusion of the mind. Therefore it is to be rooted out from the mind at once, and with all diligence. The minds of men are entangled in the net of greed like poor stags. They are rendered as helpless as beasts of prey in the forests of the world. He who by his reasoning has removed the vain anxieties of his mind has displayed the light of his soul, like that of the unclouded sun to sight. Therefore know that the mind makes the man, and not his body, as some think. The body is dull matter, but the mind is neither a material nor immaterial substance. Whatever is done with the mind by any man, know, Rama, that act is actually done by him. Whatsoever is shunned by the mind, know that it is kept out in actuality. The mind alone makes the whole world to the utmost end of the spheres. The mind is the emptiness, and the air and the earth in its greatness. If the mind does not join a thing with its known properties and qualities, then the sun, planets, and stars would appear to be without their light. The mind assumes the properties of knowledge and ignorance, from which it is called a knowing or unknowing thing. But these properties are not to be attributed to the body, for a living body is never known to be wise, or a dead carcass an ignorant person. The mind becomes sight in its act of seeing, and hearing when it hears anything. It is feeling when the skin touches anything, and smelling when something touches the nose. It becomes taste connected with the tongue and palate, and takes many other names besides according to its other faculties. Thus the mind is the chief actor on the stage of the living animal body. It magnifies the minute and makes the true appear as untrue. It sweetens the bitter and sours the sweet, and turns a foe to a friend, and vice versa. In whatever manner the mind represents itself in its various aspects, the same becomes evident to its both in our perception and conception of them. It was by virtue of such a representation that the dreaming mind of King Harish Chandra took the course of one night for the long period of 12 years. It was owing to a similar idea of the mind that the whole creation of Brahma appeared to be situated within himself. The presentation of a fair prospect before the imagination turns the present pain to pleasure, like a man bound in chains forgets his painful state in the hopes of his release the next morning. The mind, being well fortified and brought under the subjection of reason, brings all the parts of the body and internal passions of the heart under our control. But a loose and ungoverned mind gives a loose rein to go astray. Like the loosened thread of a string of pearls scatters the precious grains at random over the ground. The mind that preserves its clear-sightedness, equanimity, and stability in all places, and under all conditions retains its even temper and good discernment at all times, under the testimony of its consciousness and approbation of its good conscience. O Rama, you must retain your self-possession at all times, and remain like an unmoved, dumb, and dull body, with your mind acquainted with the states of all things, but undisturbed by the fluctuation of the objects that come into your awareness. The mind by its own nature is restless with all its vain thoughts and desires within itself. Man is carried abroad by its currents over hills and deserts and across rivers and seas to far and remote cities and countries. The waking mind deems the objects of its desire to be as sweet as honey, and whatever it does not like to be as bitter as gall, even though they may be sweet to taste. Some minds, with too much self-reliance upon themselves, and without considering the true nature of things, give them different forms and colors according to their own conceptions and opinions, though they are far from truth. The mind is a pulsation of the power of divine consciousness. It ventilates and breathes and glares in luminous bodies, melts in liquids and hardens into solid substance. It vanishes into emptiness and extends in space. It dwells in everything at its pleasure and flies from everywhere at its will. It whitens black and blackens white, and it is confined to no place or time, but extends through all. The mind being absent or settled elsewhere, we do not taste the sweet that we are sucking, swallowing, or grinding under our teeth or licking with the tongue. What is seen by the mind is seen with the eyes, and what it does not see is never seen by the visual organs, just like things lying in the dark are not perceptible to the sight. The mind is embodied in the physical body, accompanied by the organs of sense. But it is the mind that actuates the senses and receives the sensation. The senses are the products of the mind, but the mind is not a production of sensation. Those great souls or philosophers who have investigated the connection between the two quite different substances of body and mind, and those learned men who show us how boy and mind are mutually related, are truly worthy of our veneration. A beautiful woman decorated with flowers in the braids of her hair and looking loosely with her amorous glances is like a log of wood in contact with the body of one whose mind is absent with himself. The dispassionate yogi who sits reclined in its abstract meditation in the forest, owing to the absence of his mind, has no sense of his hands being bitten off by a ferocious beast. The mind of a sage, practiced in mental abstraction, may with ease be inclined to convert his pleasure to pain and his pain to pleasure. The mind employed in some other thought and inattentive to the present discourse finds it like a piece of wood cut off by an axe. A man sitting at home and thinking of standing on the precipice of a mountain or falling into a hollow cave shudders at the idea of this imminent danger. So also one is startled at the prospect of a dreary desert even in his dream, and is bewildered to imagine the vast deep under the clouds. The mind feels a delight at the sight of a lovely spot in its dreams, and at seeing the hills, cities, and houses stretching, or the clusters of stars shining in the extended plain of the sky. The restless mind is busy stretching many a hill, city, valley, and houses in our dreams, like waves in the vast ocean of the soul. As the waters of the sea display themselves in huge surges, billows, and waves, so the mind that is in the body dispels itself in the various sights exhibited in our dreams. As the leaves and branches, flowers and fruits are the products of the shooting seed, so everything that is seen in our waking dreams is the creation of our mind. As the golden image is no other than gold, so the creatures of our living dreams are nothing but the creation of our fanciful mind. As a drop in the shower of rain and the foam or froth of the wave are only different forms of water, so the varieties of phenomena that are sensed are only transformations of the same mind. These are only the thoughts of our minds seen in our waking dream, like the various costumes that an actor wears to represent different characters in a play. As King Lavana believed himself to be a tribal for some time, so we believe ourselves to be so-and-so by the thoughts of our mind. Whatever we think ourselves to be in our consciousness, the same soon comes to pass upon us. Therefore, mold the thoughts of your mind in any way you like. An embodied being sees many cities, towns, hills, and rivers before him, all of which are only visions of waking dreams stretched out before the inner mind. One sees a demon and a god and a snake where there is no snake. It is the idea that fosters the thought, as King Lavana fostered the thoughts of his ideal forms. As the idea of man includes that of a woman, and the idea of father implies that of a son, so the mind includes the wish, and with every person the wish is accompanied by its action. It is by its wish that the mind is subject to death to be born again in other bodies. Though the mind is a formless thing of its nature, yet by its constant habit of thinking it contracts a notion of it being a living substance or jiva. The mind is busy with thoughts of long-drawn wishes that causes it repeated birth and death, and their accompaniments of hopes and fears, pleasure and pain. Pleasure and pain are situated in the mind like oil and sesame seed. They are thickened or thinned like oil under the particular circumstance of life. Prosperity thickens our pleasure and adversity our pain. These are thinned by their reverse again. Like the greater or lighter pressure of the oil mill that thickens or thins the oil, so the deeper or lighter attention of the mind aggravates or lightens its sense of pleasure or pain. As our wishes are directed by particular circumstance of time and place, so the measurement of time and place are made according to the intensity or laxity of our thoughts. It is the mind that is satisfied and delighted at the fulfillment of our wishes, and not the body which is unconscious of its enjoyment. The mind is delighted with its imaginary desires within the body, like a secluded woman takes delight in the harem. He who does not give indulgence to levities and fickleries in his heart is sure to subdue his mind, as one binds an elephant by its chain to the post. He whose mind does not wave back and forth like a brandished sword, but remains fixed as a pillar as its best intended object, is the best of men on earth. All others are like insects continually moving in the mind. He whose mind is free from fickleness and is sedate in itself is united with his best object in him, meditation of the same. Steadiness of mind is attended with stillness of worldly commotion, just as the suspension of churning Mandara mountain was attended with the calmness of the ocean of milk. The thought of the mind embroiled in worldly cares becomes the source of those turbulent passions in the heart which, like poisonous plants, fills this harmful world. Foolish men, infatuated by their giddiness and ignorance, revolve around the center of their hearts like giddy bees, flutter around the lotus flowers of the lake, until at last, weary from their giddy circles, they fall down in the whirlpool that hurl them into irreparable ruin. Book 3, Chapter 111. The Necessity to Control the Heart and Mind. Vasistha continued, "Now listen to what I tell you. It is the best remedy to heal the disease of the heart. It is within one's own power, and harmless and a sweet potion to taste. It is by your own exertion of your own consciousness and by diligent renunciation of the best objects that you desire that you can bring back your unmanageable mind under your control. He who remains at rest by giving up the objects of his desire is truly the conqueror of his mind, which is reduced under his subjection like an elephant lacking its tusks. The mind is to be carefully treated like a patient with prescriptions of reason and by discriminating truth from untruth, just as we distinguish a good diet from what is injurious. Mold your heated imagination by cool reasoning, by precepts of the Scriptures, and by association with the dispassionate, as they do heated iron with a cold hammer. Like a boy who suffers no pain during himself this way and that way in his play, so it is not difficult to turn the mind from one thing to another at pleasure. Employ your mind to acts of goodness by the light of your understanding, and join your soul to the meditation of God by the light of your spirit. The renunciation of a highly desirable object is within the power of one who resigns himself to the divine will. Therefore, it is a shame to that worm of human being who finds this teaching difficult to practice. He who in his understanding can take the unpleasant for the pleasurable may with ease subdue his mind. Like a giant by his might overcomes a boy. It is possible to govern the mind by one's attention and effort like controlling a horse. When the mind is brought still, it is easy to enter into divine knowledge. Shame on that jackass man who does not have the power to subdue his restless mind. It is entirely under his own control, and he can easily govern it. No one can reach the best course of his life without tranquility of his mind. This is to be acquired by means of his own effort to get rid of the fond objects of his desire. By destroying the mind's appetites and through reason and knowledge of truth, one can have his absolute dominion over the mind without any change or rival in it. The precepts of a teacher, the instructions of the Scripture, the efficacy of mantras, and the force of arguments are all trifles like bits of straw if the mind is not calm. Calmness can be gained by renouncing our desires and knowledge of truth. Only when all the desires of the mind are cut off by the weapon of indifference to all worldly things can the one all-pervading, quiescent Brahman be known. All men's bodily pains are quite at an end as soon as the mind is at rest, after the removal of mental anxieties by means of true knowledge. Many persons turn their minds away from mindfulness by too much trust in their efforts and imagined expectations, and disregarding the power of destiny that rules over all human efforts. The mind, when it becomes long practiced in its highest duty, the cultivation of divine knowledge, becomes extinct in consciousness and is elevated to its higher state of intellectual form. Join yourself first to your intellectual or abstract thoughts, and then to your spiritual speculations. Then, being the master of your mind, contemplate on the nature of the Supreme Soul. Thus, relying on your own efforts and converting the conscious mind to its state of detached unconsciousness, you can attain that highest state of stability that knows no decay or destruction. It is by your efforts and fixed attention, O Rama, that you can correct the errors of your mind, just like one gets over his wrong perceptions of mistaking one thing for another. Calmness of mind dispels anxiety. A man who is able to subdue his mind doesn't care a fig for a subjection of the world under him. Worldly possessions are attended with strife and warfare. The enjoyments of heaven also have their rise and fall, but in the improvement of one's own mind and nature there is no contention with anyone or any obstruction of any kind. Those who cannot manage to keep their minds under proper control find it hard to manage their affairs well. The thoughts of being dead and being born again as a man continually occupy the minds of the ignorant with the idea of their ego. Nobody is born here or dies at any time. The mind conceives its birth and death and migration in other bodies and worlds. It goes from here to another world, and there it appears in another form, or it is relieved from the encumbrance of flesh, which is called its liberation. Then where is this death, and why fear to die? Whether the mind wanders here or goes to another world with earthly thoughts, it continues in the same state as before, unless it is changed to another form by its attainment of liberation. It is in vain that we are overwhelmed in sorrow upon the death of our brethren and dependents. We know it is the nature of the mind to be deluded from its state of pure consciousness to that of error. It is repeatedly stated, both before and afterwards in many other places of this work, that there is no other means of obtaining true knowledge without subduing the mind. I repeat the same lesson, that there is no way except by government of the unruly mind to come to the light of the truly real, clear, and universal knowledge of the Supreme. The mind destroyed, the soul attains its tranquility, and the light of the intellect shines forth in the cavity of the heart. Hold fast the discus of reason, and cut off the bias of your mind. Be sure that no disease will have the power to molest you, if you have the good sense to despise objects of pleasure that are attended by pain. By lopping the members of the mind, you cut it off altogether. These members, this essence of the mind, are ego and selfishness. Shun your senses that it is I and these are mine. Without these feelings, the mind is cast down like a tree felled by an axe. It is dispersed like a scattered cloud from an autumn sky. The mind is blown away by its lack of ego and selfishness, like a cloud by the wind. It is dangerous to wage a war against winds, weapons, fire, or water in order to obtain the objects of worldly desire, but there is no danger whatever in destroying the growing soft and tender desires of the mind. What is good and what is not are well known for certain, even to children. Therefore employ your mind to what is good, as they train children in the path of goodness. Our minds are as stubborn and indomitable as ferocious lions of the forest. They are true victors who have conquered these, and are thereby entitled to salvation. Our desires, with their unsatisfied thirst after monetary gain, are like fierce lions. Desires lead us to dangers, and are as delusive as the mirage of the desert. The man without desires cares for nothing, whether the winds howl with the fury of storms, or the seas break their bounds, or the 12 sons of the zodiac rise at once to burn the universe. The mind is the root that grows the plants of our good and evil, and all our happiness and sorrow. The mind is the tree of the world, and all peoples are like its branches and leaves. One who has freed his mind from his desires prospers everywhere. He who lives in the dominion of detachment rests in its heavenly joy. The more we curb the desires of our mind, the greater we feel our inward happiness. Like the fire being extinguished, we find ourselves cooled from its heat. Should the mind long for millions of worldly mansions in its highest ambition, it is sure to have them spread out to view within the minute particle of its own essence. Opulence and expectancy is full of anxiety to the mind. When gained, the expected wealth is no less troublesome to the mind, but the treasure of contentment is filled with a lasting peace of mind. Therefore, be victorious over your greedy mind by abandonment of all your desires. With the holy virtue of your unmindfulness, and with the even-mindedness of those who have known a divine spirit, and also with the subdued, moderated, and defeated yearning of your heart, make the state of the uncreated one as your very own. Book 3, Chapter 112. Motion or restlessness is inherent in the mind. The mind is its own cure. Vasistha continued, whatever the nature of the object of any man's desire, his mind does not fail to run after it with great eagerness in every place. The eagerness of the mind rises and sets by turns with view of the desired object, like clear bubbles of water foaming and bursting of themselves with the breath of winds. As coldness is the nature of frost and blackness is that of ink, so is swiftness or momentum the nature of the mind, as stillness is that of the soul. Rama said, tell me, sage, why is the mind identified with motion, and what is the cause of its velocity? Tell me also if there is any other force that can impede the mind's motion. Vasistha replied, "We have never seen the motionless quiet of the mind. Speed is the nature of the mind, like heat is out of the fire. This vacillating power of motion which is implanted in the mind is known to be of the same nature as that of the self-motive force of the divine mind that is the cause of the momentum and motion of those worlds. As the essence of air is imperceptible without its movement, so we can have no notion of the momentum of our minds apart from the idea of their vibration. The mind, which has no motion, is said to be dead and defunct. The suspension of mental agitation is the condition of yoga stillness and leads to our ultimate liberation. The mortification of the mind is attended with the subsidence of our sorrows, but agitated thought in the mind are causes of all our sorrows. The monster of the mind, being roused from its rest, raises all our dangers and disasters, but its falling into rest and inaction causes our happiness and perfect joy. The restlessness of the mind is the effect of its ignorance. Therefore, Rama, exert your reason to destroy all its desires. Destroy the internal desires of your mind that are raised by ignorance alone, and attain your supreme joy by your resignation to the divine will. The mind is a thing that stands between the real and the unreal, and between intelligence and dull matter. The mind is moved to and fro by the contending powers of either side. Impelled by dull material force, the mind is lost in the investigation of material objects until at last, by its habitual thought of materiality, it is converted to a material object, resembling dull matter itself. But the mind, being guided by its intellectual power to investigate abstract truth, becomes an intelligent and intellectual principle by its continued practice of thinking itself as such. By virtue of the exertion of your manly powers and activities, and by force of constant habit and continued practice, you can succeed in attaining anything to which you employ your mind with diligence. You also can be free from fears and find your rest in your reliance upon the being without sorrow, provided you exercise your manly activities and use your intelligence to curb the tendencies of your mind. By the force of your intelligent mind, you must lift up your deluded mind that is drowned in the cares of this world. There is no other way. Only the mind is capable of subduing the mind, for who can subdue king unless he is a king himself? Our minds are the boats to lift us from the ocean of this world where we are carried too far by its beating waves and thrown into the whirlpools of despair, and where we are caught by the sharks of our greediness. Let your own mind cut the mind's net that is ensnared in this world, and extricate your soul by this wise policy, which is the only means of your liberation. Let the wise destroy the desires of their minds, and this will set them free from the bonds of ignorance. Shun your desire for earthly enjoyment, and forsake your knowledge of dualism. Then get rid of your impression of entity and non-entity, and be happy with the knowledge of one unity. Thought of all unknowable will remove the thoughts of known perception. This is equivalent to the destruction of desire, and also of the mind in ignorance. The unknown one, of which we are unconscious by our knowledge of phenomena, transcends anything and everything known by our consciousness. Our unconsciousness is our nirvana and final extinction, while our consciousness is the cause of our sorrow. By their own attention, men soon come to the knowledge of phenomena, but it is the unknowing or unconsciousness of these that is our nirvana. Our consciousness is the cause of our sorrow. Destroy, O Rama, whatever is desirable to your mind, and is the object of your affection. Then, knowing them as reduced to nothing, forsake your desires as seedless sprouts, and live content without the feeling of joy and grief. Book 3, Chapter 113. The Description of Ignorance and Delusion, of Vidya. Vasistha continued, False desires that continually rise in the heart are like the appearance of the false moons in the sky, and should be shunned by the wise. They rise in the minds of the unwise amidst their ignorance. Everything that is known only by its name and not in actuality cannot reside in the mind of wise people. Be wise, O Rama, and do not think like the ignorant. Consider well all that I tell you. There is no second moon in the sky, but it appears so only by deception of our optical vision. There exists nothing real or unreal anywhere except the only true essence of God, just like there is no substantiality in the continuity of the waves other than the body of water. There is no reality in anything, whether existent or non-existent, all which are mere creations of your shadowy ideality. Therefore do not impute any shape or figure to the eternal, boundless, and pure Spirit of God. You are no maker or master of anything, then why consider any act or things as your own? You do not know what these existences are, or by whom and from where they are made. Do not think that you are an actor, because no actor can attempt to do anything. Discharge whatever is your duty and remain at your ease with having done your part. Though you are the actor of an action, do not think of yourself as such. Mind your inability to do or undo anything. How can you boast of being an actor when you know your inability for action? If truth is delectable and untruth is odious, then remain firm to what is good and be employed in your duties. But as the whole world is a gallery, a magic and an unreality, then say what reliance is there in it, and what signifies pleasure or displeasure to anyone. Know Rama, this egg of the world is a delusion, and being non-existent in itself, it appears the real existence to others. Know this busy sphere of the world, so full with its non-existent, to be an ideal fantasy presented for the delusion of our minds. It is like a beautiful bamboo plant, all hollow within and without pith or marrow inside, or like the curling waves of the sea, both of which are born to perish without being uprooted from the bottom. This world is as evaporated as the air and water flying in the air, incapable of being touched or held in the hand, and as precipitous as the waterfall in its course. It appears as a flowery garden, but never comes to any good use at all. The billowy sea in the mirage presents the form of water without quenching our thirst. Sometimes it seems to be straight, and in others a curve. Now it is long, and now short, and now it is moving and quiet again. Everything in it, though originally for our good, conspires to our evil only. Though hollow inside, the world appears to be full with apparent content. Though all the worlds are continually in motion, yet they seem to be standing still. Whether they be dull matter or intelligence, their existence depends upon their motion, and these, without stopping anywhere for a moment, present the sight of their being quite at rest. Though they are as bright as light to sight, they are as opaque in their bowels as dark coal. Though they are moved by a superior power, they appear to be moving of themselves. They fade away with the brighter lights of the sun, but brighten in the darkness of the night. Their light is like that of a mirage created by the reflection of sunbeam. Human greed is like a black serpent, crooked and venomous, thin and soft in its form, but rough and dangerous in its nature, and ever unsteady as a woman. Without the objects of our affection, our love of the world soon ceases, like the lamp is extinguished without its oil, and as the vermilion mark is soon worn off. Our false hopes are as transient as the impermanent flashes of lightning. Hopes glare and flare for a moment, then disappear in the air like these transitory flashes of light. The objects of our desires are often had without our seeking, but they are as frail as the fire of heaven. They appear to vanish like twinkling lightning, and being held carefully in the hand, they burn it like an electric fire. Many things come to us unasked, and though appearing delightful at first, they prove troublesome to us at last. Hopes delayed are like flowers growing out of season, which neither bear their fruit or answer our purpose. Every accident tends to our misery, as unpleasant dreams annoy our sleep and disturb our rest. It is our delusion, avidya, that presents these many and big worlds before us, just like our dreams produce, sustain, and destroy all appearance of vision in 1 minute. It was delusion that made 1 minute appear as many years to King Lavana, and the space of 1 night seemed like the long period of a dozen of years to Harish Chandra. Such also is the case which separated lovers among rich people, that in the absence of their beloved a single night seems like an entire year to them. It is this delusive avidya that shortens the flight of time to the rich and happy, and prolongs its course with the poor and miserable, all of whom are subject to the power of delusion. The power of this delusion is essentially spread over all the works of creation, like the light of a lamp spreads over things in its brightness and not in substance. As a female form represented in a picture is no woman and has no power to do anything, so this delusion that presents us in the shapes of our desired objects in the picture of the mind can produce nothing in reality. The delusion consists in building aerial castles without substance in the mind. Though these appear in hundreds and thousands of shapes, they have no substance to them. It deludes the ignorant, like a mirage misleads deer in the desert, but false appearances cannot deceive the knowing man. These appearances, like foaming water, are as continuous as they are impermanent. They are as fleeting as a driving frost that cannot be held in the hand. This delusion holds the world in its grasp and flies aloft with it in the air. It blinds us like flying dust raised by its furious blast. Covered with dust and with heat and sweat of its body, it grasps the air and flies all about the world. The deluded man ever works with persistent and runs everywhere after its greed. As drops of rainwater falling from the clouds form the great rivers and seas, and as scattered straw tied together make a strong rope to bind beasts, so the combination of all the delusive objects in the world makes the great delusion of reality and lust. Poets describe the fluctuations of the world as a series of waves, and the world itself as a bed of lotuses, pleasant to sight but floating on an unstable element. But I compare it to the porous stalk of a lotus, full of perforations and opening inside, and to a pool of mud and mire with the filth of our sins. Men think much of their improvements of many other things on earth, but there is no improvement in this decaying world that is like a tempting cake with a coat of sweets, but full of deadly gall within. It is like a lamp whose flame is lost and fled we know not where. It is visible as a mist, but try to lay hold on it, and it proves to be nothing. This earth is a handful of ashes which, being flung aloft, flies in particles of dust. It is like the upper sky, which appears to be blue, but has no blueness in it. This delusion on earth is like the appearance of two moons in the sky, or in the vision of things in a dream, or in the motion of immovable things on the land to a passenger in a boat. Men, being long deluded by this error which has tightly laid hold of their minds, imagine a long duration of the world, as they do of the scenes in their dreams. The mind, being thus deluded by this error, sees the wonderful production of the world to rise and fall within itself like the waves of the sea. Things which are real and good appear otherwise in our error, while those that are unreal and harmful appear real and good to our deluded understanding. Our strong greed, riding on the vehicle of the desired object, chases the fleeting mind as bird-catchers chase flying birds with nets. Delusions, like a mother and wife, often offers us fresh delights with their tender looks and breasts distilling sweet milk. But these delights serve only to poison us, while they seem to cool the worlds with their distillation, just like the crescent orb of the moon injures us with too much of her moistening influence, while it appears to refresh us with her full, bright beams. Blind illusions turns meek, mild, and mute men into giddy and glamorous fools, like silent Vatala ghosts in their dancing revelry in the silent woods at night. It is under the influence of delusion that we see shapes of snakes and serpents in our brick-built and stone-made houses at nightfall. It makes a single thing appear as double, like the sight of two moons in the sky, and brings near to us what is far away like in our dreams. Delusion even causes us to dream that we are dead. It causes long to appear as short, and our nightly sleep shortens the duration of time, and makes a moment appear as a year, as in the ease of separated lovers. Look at the power of this unsubstantial ignorance, a negative thing, and still there is nothing which it cannot alter to something else. Therefore be diligent to stop the course of this delusion by your right knowledge, just as they dry up a channel by stopping the current of the stream. Rama said, "It is wonderful that a false conception that has no real existence, and is so delicate as almost a nothing but a name, should thus blind the understanding. It is strange that something without form or figure, without sense or understanding, and which is unreal and vanishing, should so blindfold the world. It is strange that a thing sparkling in darkness and vanishing in daylight, and short-sighted as the brooding owl, should keep the world in darkness. It is strange that something prone to doing evil and unable to come to light and fly from sight, and having no bodily form whatever, should thus darken the world. It is a wonder that one acting so miserly and consorting with the mean and the vile, and ever hiding herself in darkness, should thus dominate the world. It is wonderful that fallacy attended with constant sorrow and peril, and which is devoid of sense and knowledge, should keep the world in darkness. It is to be wondered that error arising from anger and greed, creeping crookedly in darkness and liable to instant death, should yet keep the world in blindness. It is surprising that error, which is a blind, dull, and stupid thing itself, and which is falsely talkative at all times, should yet mislead others in the world. It is astonishing that falsehood should betray a man after attaching as closely to him as consort, and showing all her endearment to him, but flying at the approach of his reason. It is strange that man should be blinded by the womanish attire of error, which beguiles the man, but dares not to look him in the face to face. It is strange that man is blinded by his faithless consort of error, which has no sense or intelligence, and which dies away without being killed. Tell me, sage, how this error, which has its seat in the desire, and is deeply rooted in the recesses of the heart and mind, and leads us to the challenge of endless misery by subjecting us to repeated birth and death, and to the pain of pleasure of life, is to be dispelled. Book 3, Chapter 114, Description of Error. Rama repeated, "Tell me, sage, how to remove this stony blindness of man caused by the trick of ignorance, avidya." Vasistha replied, "As the particles of snow melt at the sight of the sun, so this ignorance is dispelled immediately by a glance of the Supreme Spirit. Until then, ignorance continues to hurl down the soul and spirit as from a precipice to the depth of the world, and expose them to sorrows as thick as thorny brambles. As long as the desire of seen spirit does not rise of itself in the human soul, there is no end to this ignorance, avidya, and unconsciousness. The sight of the Supreme Spirit destroys the knowledge of our self-existence that is caused by our ignorance, just like the light of the sun destroys the shadows of things. The sight of the all-pervading God dispels our ignorance in the same manner as the light of the 12 zodiacal suns, all shining at once, puts the shadows of night to flight from all sides of the horizon. Our desires are the offspring of our ignorance, and the annihilation of these constitutes what we call our liberation. A man who is devoid of desires is reckoned the perfect and consummate master. As the night shade of desires is dissipated from the region of the mind, the darkness of ignorance is put to flight by the rise of the intellectual sun. As the dark night flies away before the advance of sunlight, so ignorance disappears before the advance of true knowledge. The stiffness of our desire tends to bind the mind fast in its worldly chains, like the advance of night serves to increase the fear of demons in children. Rama asked, the knowledge of phenomena as true makes what we call avidya or ignorance, and it is said to be dispersed by spiritual knowledge. Now tell me, sage, what is the nature of the spirit? Vasistha replied, that which is not the subject of thought, which is all-pervasive, and the thought of which is beyond expression and comprehension, is the universal spirit. That which reaches to the highest heaven of God and stretches over the lowest plots of grass on earth is the all-pervading spirit at all times, and is unknown to the ignorant soul. All this is truly Brahman, eternal and imperishable consciousness. To him no imagination of the mind can reach at any time. That which is never born or dead, and which is ever existent in all worlds, and in which the conditions of being and change are altogether wanting, which is one and one alone, all and all-pervading and imperishable unity, which is incomprehensible in thought, and is only of the form of intellect, is the universal spirit. It is accompanied with the ever-existent, all-extending, pure and undisturbed consciousness, and is that calm, quiet, even, and unchanging state of the soul, which is called the divine spirit. There resides also the impure mind, which is by nature beyond all physical objects, and runs after its own desire. It is conceivable by consciousness as sullied by its own activity. This ubiquitous, all-potent, great and godlike mind, in its imagination, separates itself from the Supreme Spirit and rises from it like a wave on the surface of the sea. There is no fluctuation or projection in the all-extending, tranquil soul of God, but these take place in the mind owing to its desires, which cause the production of all things in the world. Therefore the world, being the production of desires or will, has its extinction with the privation of desires. For that which is the growth of a thing causes its extinction also. Like the wind that kindles the fire also extinguishes it. The exertion of human effort gives rise to the expectation of results, but lack of desire causes the cessation of exertions and consequently puts a stop to the desire activity, and our ignorance that causes desire. The thought that I am distinct from Brahman binds the mind to the world, but the belief that Brahman is all releases the mind from its bondage. Every thought about one's self fastens his bondage to the world, but release from selfish thought leads him to his own liberation. Cease from your selfish cares, and you shall cease to work with persistence for nothing. There is no lake of lotuses in the sky, nor is there a lotus growing in the gold mine whose fragrance fills the air and attracts the blue bees to suck its honey. The goddess of ignorance, with her uplifted arms resembling the long stalks of lotus plants, laughs over her conquests and exultation with the glaring light of shining moonbeams. Such is the net of our wishes that our minds spread before us, which represent unrealities as real, and take a delight to dwell upon them, like children in their toys. So also is the trap spread out by our own ignorance all over this world. It ensnares busy people to their misery in all places, just as it tightly binds ignorant men and children in its chains. Men are busy with worldly affairs with such thoughts as, I am poor and bound in this earth for my life, but I have my hands and feet with which I must work for myself. But they are freed from all affairs of this life who know themselves a spiritual being, and that their spiritual part is neither subject to bondage nor labor. The thought that I am neither flesh or bones, but something other than my body, releases one from his bondage. One having such assurance within is said to have weakened his avidya or ignorance. The imagination of earthly men paint ignorance as dark as the darkness that surrounds the brightest pinnacle of Mount Meru, blazing with the blue light of sapphire, or at the primeval darkness impenetrable by sunlight. Earth-born mortals also represent ignorance as the blackness which naturally covers the face of heaven by its own nature, like the blue vault of the sky. Thus, in the imagination of the unenlightened, ignorance is pictured with a visible form, but the enlightened never attribute qualities of physical sensation to inanimate and imaginary objects. Rama said, "Tell me, sage, what is the cause of the blueness of the sky, if it is not the reflection of the blue gems on Meru's peak? Is it a collection of darkness at night by itself?" Vasistha replied, "Rama, the sky being only an empty vacuum cannot have the quality of blueness which is commonly attributed to it, nor is it the bluish luster of the blue gems that are supposed to abound on the top of Meru. Nor is there any possibility of a body of darkness abiding in the sky when the cosmic egg is full of light, which has displaced the primeval darkness, and when the nature of light is the brightness that stretches over the extraterrestrial regions. O fortunate Rama, the sky, which is a vast vacuum, is open to a sister of ignorance with regard to its inner hollowness. As one, after losing his eyesight, sees only darkness all about him, so the lack of the objects of sight in the womb of emptiness gives the sky the appearance of a dark scene. By understanding this, as you come to the knowledge that the apparent blackness of the sky is no black color of its own, so you come to learn the seeming darkness of ignorance to be no darkness in reality. Want of desire or its detachment is the destroyer of ignorance. It is as easy to affect it as to annihilate a lake of lotuses growing in the sky. It is better, O good Rama, to distrust the delusions of this world and disbelieve the blueness of the sky than to labor under the error of their reality. The thoughts that I am dead makes one as sad as when he dreams of his death in sleep. Similarly, the thought that I am living makes one as cheerful as when he wakes from the deadly dream of his death-like sleep. Foolish imagination make the mind as dull as that of a fool, but reasonable reflection leadeth to wisdom and clear-sightedness. A moment's reflection of the reality of the world and of his own essence casts the man into the gloom of everlasting ignorance, while his forgetfulness of these removes all mortal thoughts from his mind. Ignorance produces passions and temptations for all transient objects. Ignorance is busy destroying the knowledge of the soul. It is destroyed only by knowledge of the soul. Whatever the mind seeks is instantly supplied by the organs of action which serve as ministers subservient to the orders of their king. Therefore, he who, by his diligent application to spirituality, does not attend to the dictates of his mind in the pursuit of phenomena, entertains the tranquility of his innermost soul. What did not exist at first has no existence even now. That which appears as existent is nothing other than the quiescent and immaculate essence, Brahma himself. Let no other thought of any person, thing, place, or object employ your mind at any time, except that of the immutable, everlasting, and unlimited Spirit of Brahma. Rely upon the superior power of your understanding. Exert your sovereign intellect, and root out all worldly desires by enjoyment of the pleasure of your mind. The great ignorance that rises in the mind and raises the desire of your heart has spread the net of your false hopes for your ruin, causing your death and decrepitude under them. Your wishes burst out in expressions such as, "These are my sons, and these are my treasures. I am such a one, and these things are mine." All this is the effect of a magic spell of ignorance that binds you tightly. Your body is a void in which your desires have produced all your selfish thoughts, like empty winds, rising waves on the surface of the sea. Learn, you who are seeker of the truth, that the words I and mine and this and that are all meaningless in their true sense. There is nothing that may be called real at any time except knowledge of the true self and essence of Brahman. The heavens above and the earth below, with all the ranges of hills and mountains on earth, and all the lines of its rivers and lakes, are only the dissolving sights seen in the same or different lights as they are represented by our ignorance. Phenomena rise to view from our ignorance and disappear before the light of knowledge. They appear in various forms in the substratum of the soul, just as the fallacy of a snake appears in the substance of a rope. Rama, know that only the ignorant are liable to the error of taking the earth, sun, and stars for realities. Not so the learned, to whom the great Brahman is present in all his majesty, and full glory in all places and things. While the ignorant labor under the doubt of two ideas, a rope and a snake in the rope, the learned are firm in their belief and sight of one true God in all things. Therefore do not think like the ignorant, but well consider all things like the wise and the learned. Forsake your earthly wishes, and do not grope like the vulgar by believing the not-self to be the self. Of what good is this dull and dumb body to you, Rama, in your future state, that you are so overcome by alternating joy and grief at its pleasure and pain? Like the wood of a tree, its gum resin, and its fruit and seed are not one and the same thing, though they are so closely related to one another. So this body and the embodied being are quite separate from one another, though they are so closely united with each other. As the burning of a pair of bellows does not blow out the fire or stop the air blown by another pair, so the vital air is not destroyed by destruction of the body, but finds its way into another form and frame elsewhere. The thought that I am happy or miserable is as false an idea of water in a mirage. Knowing it is such, give up your misconception of pleasure and pain and place your reliance upon the sole truth. Oh, how wonderful it is that men have so utterly forgotten the true Brahman, and have placed their reliance on false ignorance, the sole cause of error. Do not, O Rama, give way to ignorance in your mind, which being overspread by its darkness will render it difficult for you to pass over the errors of the world. Know ignorance to be a false fiend and deluder of the strongest minds. It is the baneful cause of endless sorrows and produces the poisonous fruit of illusion. It imagines hellfire in the cooling beams of the watery orb of the moon. Ignorance conceives the torments of infernal fires proceeding from the refreshing beams of that celestial light. It views a dry desert and wide waters rolling with waves and undulating with the fragrance of the aqueous kalpa flowers. It imagines a dry mirage in the empty clouds of autumn. Ignorance builds imaginary castles on empty air, and causes the air of rising and falling toward its clouds. It is the delusion of our fancy that makes us feel the emotions of pleasure and pain in our dreams. If the mind is not filled and led away by worldly desires, then there is no fear of falling into the danger that the daydreams of our earthly affairs constantly present before us. The more our false knowledge lays hold of our mind, the more we feel the torment of hell and its punishment in us, like nightmares in sleep. The mind, pierced by error, as if by the thorny stalk of a lotus, sees the whole world revolving before it like the sea rolling with its waves. Ignorance takes possession of the mind, converts enthroned princes to peasants, and reduces them to a condition worse than that of a beastly hunter. Therefore, Rama, give up the earthly desire that serveth best to bind down the soul to this mortal earth and its mortifying cares. Remain like the pure white crystal, reflecting the colors of all things around it in your stainless mind. Employ your mind to your duties without being tarnished by your attachment to any. Remain like the unsullied crystal, receiving the reflections of outward objects without being stained by any. Knowing everything with eagerness in your watchful mind and performing all your duties with due submission, and staying away from the common track with your exalted mind, you will raise yourself above comparison with any other person. Book 3, Chapter 115, The Causes of Happiness and Misery. Valmiki relates, being thus encouraged by the high-minded Vasistha, Rama's lotus eyes became open like new-blown flowers. He shone forth with a pure grace, his heart expanded, and his face blooming like the fresh lotus reviving at the end of a night under the vivifying beams of the rising sun. His smiling face shone like a moon with inward enlightenment and wonder. Then, with the nectar beams of his bright and white pearly teeth, Rama spoke out these words. Rama said, "What a wonder that the lack of ignorance should subdue all things, as if it could tie down huge hills with the thin threads of lotus stalks. Oh, that this straw of the earth, which shows itself to be so dense a body in the world, is no more than the production of our ignorance, which shows the unreal as a reality. Tell me more for my enlightenment regarding the true nature of this magical earth, which rolls like a ceaseless stream running amidst the ethereal worlds. There is another great question that worries my heart. What happened to the fortunate Lavana in the end? Also tell me more about the embodied soul and the animated body, whether they are in concord or discord with another, and which of them is the active agent and recipient of the rewards of acts in this earth. Tell me also who was that sorcerer and where he fled after putting the good King Lavana to all his tribulation, and then restoring him to his former exalted position. Vasistha said, the body is like a frame of woodwork that contains nothing. It receives the reflection of an intelligence as in a dream, and this is called the mind. This mind becomes the living principle life, and also has the power of thinking. It is as unstable as a boat on the current of world of affairs, and it plays the part of a fickle monkey amidst the busy castle of the world. The active principle in the body is known under different names: the mind, life, ego, and having a body for its home, it is employed in a variety of actions. This active principle is subject to endless pains and pleasures in its unenlightened or unawakened state, and the body has no relation with them. Unenlightened understanding also has received many fictitious names according to the various faculties that it exhibits in its acts. As long as an unawakened mind is in its sleeping state, it perceives the busy bustle of the world as in a dream, which is unknown to the waking or enlightened mind. As long as a living being is not awakened from its sleep, it has to labor under the inseparable mist of worldly errors. But the darkness hanging over the minds of the enlightened is put to flight as quickly as the shade of night, spreading over the bed of lotuses, is dispersed at sunrise. That which the learned call the heart, the mind, the individual soul, ignorance, desire, and the principle of action, is the embodied being that is subject to the feeling of both pleasure and pain. The body is dull matter unconscious of pain and pleasure. Men of right reason say that the embodied being is subject to pain and pleasure because of its stubborn ignorance and irrationality. The embodied being is the cause of its own misery. The individual soul is the subject of its good and bad action. It becomes confined in its body because of its irrationality and remains trapped there like a silkworm in its cocoon. The mind, being tied to its ignorance, exerts its faculties in various ways, and turns round like a wheel in its various pursuits and employments. The mind dwelling in the body makes it rise and sit, eat and drink, walk and go, hurt and kill, all of which are acts of the mind and not of the body. As the master of the house does his many acts in it, and not the house itself, so the mind acts its different parts in the body, and not the body by itself. The mind is the active and passive agent of all actions and passions, and of the pains and pleasures of the body. It is only the mind that makes the man. Now hear me tell you the useful moral of the story of Lavana, and how he was transformed to a tribal outcast by derangement of his mind. The mind has to feel the effects of its actions, whether good or evil. In order that you may understand it well, listen attentively to what I will now tell you. Lavana was born of the line of King Harish Chandra. One day, as he was sitting apart from all others at his court, he was thinking to himself, "My grandfather was a great king and performed the Rajasuya sacrifice. I, being born of this line, must perform the same in my mind." Having determined so, and getting the things ready for the sacrifice, he entered the sacrificial hall for his initiation into the sacred rites. He called the sacrificial priests and honored the holy saints. He invited the gods to it and lighted the sacrificial fire. Having performed the sacrifice to his heart's content, and having honored the gods, sages, and Brahmins, he went to a forest to live there for a year, all in his own mind. Then, having made presents of all his wealth to Brahmins and other men, he awoke from his slumber in the same forest by the evening of that day. Thus King Lavana attained the merit of the sacrifice in his internal satisfaction of having attained the merit of the sacrifice. Hence learn to know that the mind is the recipient of pleasure and pain. Therefore employ your attention, Rama, to the purification of your mind. Every man becomes perfect in his mind in its full time and proper place, but he is utterly lost who believes himself to be composed only of his body. The mind being roused to transcendental reason, all miseries are removed from rational understanding, just like the beams of the rising sun falling upon the lotus bud dispel the darkness that had closely contracted its folded petals. Book 3, Chapter 116. The Moral of King Lavana's Experience, Summary of Creation and Liberation. Rama said, "Sage, what is the evidence that Lavana obtained the reward of his mental Rajasuya sacrifice through his transformation into the state of a tribal, as it was wrought upon him by the enchantment of the magician?" Vasistha answered, "I was myself present at King Lavana's court when the magician made his appearance, and I saw everything that took place with my own eyes. After the magician finished his work and left, King Lavana respectfully asked me with the other courtiers to explain to him what had happened. After I pondered the matter and had clearly seen its cause, I explained the meaning of the magician's spell. This is the way I will now explain it to you, my Rama. I remembered that all those who performed Rajasuya sacrifice were subjected to various painful difficulties and dangers, which they had to suffer for a full 12 years. It was then that Indra, the Lord of Heaven, had compassion for Lavana and sent his heavenly messenger in the form of a magician to avert this calamity. He taxed the king who would make the Rajasuya sacrifice with the infliction of the very many hardships in his dream, then departed on his aerial journey to the abode of the gods and spiritual masters. Thus, Rama, it is quite evident that there is no doubt in it. The mind is the active and passive agent of all kinds of action in their sequence. Therefore, rub out the dirt of your heart and polish the gem of your mind. Using the fire of your reason to melt the mind down like a particle of ice, attain your chief supreme good at last. Know the mind is identical to ignorance, which by its magical power presents these multitudes and endless varieties of beings and things before you. There is no difference in the meaning of the words ignorance, mind, understanding, and individual soul, as in the word tree and all its synonyms. Knowing this truth, keep a steady mind free from all its desires. As the orb of the clear sun of your intellect has its rise, so the darkness of your willing and unwilling flies away from you. Know also this truth. There is nothing in the world that you cannot see, or which you cannot make your own, or which can be taken away from you. There is nothing that does not die, or what is not yours or someone else's. All things become all at all times. The multitudes of existent bodies and their known properties meet together in the substantiality of Brahman, just like the various kinds of unfired clay vessels are melted down in the same watery substance. Rama said, Sage, you said that by weakening the desire of our mind, we can put an end to our pleasure and pain. But tell me now, how is it possible to stop the course of our naturally fickle minds? Vasistha replied, Hear, O bright moon of Raghu's race, I will tell you the proper course for quieting the restless mind. By knowing this, you shall obtain peace of mind and be freed from the actions of your organ of senses. I have told you before about the triple nature of the production of beings here below, which I believe you well remember. Of these the first is the power Brahma, who assumed to himself the shape of the divine will, and saw in his presence in whatever he wished to produce, through which he brought the physical system into existence. He thought of many changes in his mind, like those of birth and death, pleasure and pain, the course of nature and the effect of ignorance and the like. Then, having ordained them as he willed, he disappeared of himself like snow before sunlight. Thus this God, the personification of will, rises and sets repeatedly as he is prompted from time to time by his inner wish. So there are millions of Brahmas born in this cosmic egg. Many have gone by and are yet to come, whose number is innumerable. All living beings are in the same predicament as Brahma, proceeding continually from the entity of God. Now I will tell you how they live and how they are liberated from the bonds of life. The mental power issuing from Brahma rests on the wide expanse of emptiness spread before it. Then, being joined with the essence of ether, it becomes solidified in the shape of desire. Then, finding the miniature of matter spread out before it, it becomes the quintessence of the five elements. Having assumed afterwards the inner senses, it becomes a suitable elementary body composed of the finest particles of the five elements. It enters into grains and vegetables, which re-enter into the bowels of animals in the form of food. The essence of this food, in the form of semen, gives birth to living beings to infinity. The male child grows into boyhood, to his tutor for the acquisition of knowledge. The boy next assumes his wonderful form of youth, which next arrives to the state of manhood. The man afterwards learns to choose something for himself and rejects others by the clear-sightedness of his internal faculties. A man possessed of the right discrimination of good and evil and of right and wrong, and who is confident of the purity of his own nature and of his belonging to the best caste, Brahman, by degrees attains supernatural powers for his own good, as also for the enlightened of his mind, by means of his knowledge of the 7 essential grounds of yoga meditation. Book 3, Chapter 117. The 7 States of Ignorance. Rama said, Please, sage, tell me briefly, what are the grounds of yoga meditation that produce the 7 kinds of consummation that are the aims of yogi adepts? You are best acquainted with all esoteric truth. You, sage, must know better than all others. Vasistha replied, They consist of the 7 descending states of ignorance and the 7 ascending states of knowledge. These again diverge into many others by their mixtures together. All these states of ignorance and knowledge, being deeply rooted in the nature of man either by his habit or training, produce their respective results. Attend now to the nature of the 7 states or grounds of ignorance, and you will also come to know the nature of the 7 grounds of knowledge. This will be the shortest lesson I will give you about the definition of true knowledge and ignorance. One's own true nature is his highest knowledge and liberation. Whatever distracts one from this knowledge to the false sense of individual ego is the cause of his ignorance that leads him to the error and bondage of this world. Those who do not deviate from their awareness of the self as composed of only pure consciousness are not liable to ignorance because they lack passions, affections, and the feelings of envy and enmity. The greatest ignorance and error of mankind is forgetting self-awareness and diving into consciousness chit after thoughts of cognizable objects. The space that takes place in the mind between a past and future thought of one's object to another, that respite of the mind from thinking, is the resting of the soul in the consciousness of its true form. The state of the soul when it is calm after the setting of the thoughts and desires of the mind, and which is as cold and quiet as the bosom of a stone, and yet without the dullness of slumber or dull drowsiness, is called the repose of the soul in its recognition of itself. The soul is said to be at rest in itself and shines forth with its unsleeping intelligence when it is devoid of its sense of ego, destitute of its knowledge of dualism, and lacking in any distinction between it and the state of the one universal soul. This state of pure and self-intelligent soul is hidden by the various states of ignorance, which I will now describe to you. These are three states of wakefulness, known as embryonic waking, ordinary waking, and intense waking. Again, the different states of dreaming are also said to be the grounds of its ignorance, and these are waking dream, sleepy waking, and sound sleep. These are the 7 grounds of ignorance. These are the 7 grounds that produce sheer ignorance. When joined with one another, they become many more mixed states, known under different names, as you will hear by and by. At first there was the intelligent consciousness, which gave rise to the nameless and pure intelligence, which became the source of the would-be mind and individual soul. This intellect remained as the ever-waking embryonic seed of all, which is why it is called the waking seed. It is the first condition of cognition, so it is said to be the primal waking state. The waking state is next to the primal waking intelligence of God, and it is the belief in the individual personality of the ego. The great waking is the firm belief that I am such a one and this thing is mine by virtue of my merits in this or bygone times karma. The cognition of the reality of anything, either by bias or mistake, is called the waking dream. Examples are the sight of 2 moons in the halo, of silver and shells, water in a mirage, and the imaginary castle building of daydreamers. Dreaming in sleep is of many kinds, as is known by one upon waking who doubts their truth owing to their short-lived duration. The reliance placed on things seen in a dream, after one wakes from a sleep, is called his waking dream, and lasts only in the mind as a memory. A thing long unseen and appearing dimly with a strong figure in a dream, if taken for a real thing of the waking state, is also called a waking dream. A dream dreamt, either in the whole body or the dead body of the dreamer, appears as a phantom of the waking state. Besides these 6 states, there is a sluggish state of the individual soul, which is called his sound sleep, and is capable of feeling its future pleasure and pain. In this last state of the soul or mind, all outward objects from a straw up to a mountain appear as mere atoms of dust in its presence, just as the mind sees a miniature of the world in profound meditation. I have thus told you, Rama, the features of true knowledge and error in brief, but each of these states branches out into 100 forms with various traits of their own. A long continuous waking dream is described as the waking state, and it becomes diversified according to the diversity of its objects. The waking state contains under it the condition of the wakeful soul of God. Also, there are many things under these conditions that mislead men from one error to another, like a storm casts boats into whirlpools and eddies. Some of the lengthened dreams and sleep appear like the waking sight of daylight, while others, though seen in the broad daylight of the waking state, are no better than night dreams seen in the daytime, and therefore are called our daydreams. I have thus far related to you the 7 grades of the grounds of ignorance, with which all their verities are to be carefully avoided by the right use of our reason, and by the sight of the Supreme Soul in ourselves. Book 3, Chapter 118, The 7 Stages of Knowledge. Vasistha continued, O sinless Rama, now listen about the 7 stages of awareness. This knowledge will keep you from plunging into the mire of ignorance. Disputants are apt to describe many more stages of yoga meditation, but in my opinion, these 7 are sufficient to attain the chief good of ultimate liberation. Knowledge is understanding. It is enough for understanding to know only these 7 stages. However, liberation, which is the object of knowledge, transcends knowing these 7 stages. Knowledge of truth is liberation. Knowledge, truth, and liberation are synonymous because the living being who has known the truth is freed from reincarnation by his liberation. The grounds of knowledge comprise the desire of becoming good, and this good will is the first step. Then comes discretion or reasoning the second, followed by purity of mind, which is the third grade to gaining knowledge. The fourth is self-reliance as the true refuge. Then worldly apathy is the fifth. The sixth is the power of abstraction, and the seventh, or the last stage of knowledge, is generalization of all in one. Liberation is placed at the end of these, and is attained without difficulty after them. Attend now to the definition of these steps, as I shall explain them to you. First of all is a desire of goodness, springing from dispassion from worldly matters, and consisting in the thought, why do I sit idle? I must know the Scriptures in the company of good men. The second is discretion, which arises from association with wise and good men, study of the Scriptures, habitual aversion to worldliness, and consists in an inclination toward good conduct and doing all sorts of good acts. The third is the subduing of the mind and refraining it from sensual enjoyment. These are produced by the two former qualities of goodwill and discretion. The fourth is self-reliance and dependent on the divine Spirit as the true refuge of the soul. This is attainable by means of the three qualities described above. The fifth is worldly apathy, as shown by one's detachment from all earthly concerns and society of men, by means of the first four grounds of internal delight. By practice of these five virtues, and by the feeling of self-satisfaction and inner delight, man is freed from his thoughts and cares about all internal and external objects. Then comes the power of analytical thought into the abstract meaning of things. This is the sixth step to attain true knowledge. It is fostered either by one's own effort or guidance of others in search of truth. Continued practice of these six qualities, ignorance of differences in religion, and reducing all to the knowledge of the one true God of nature, is called generalization. This universal generalization is like a living, liberated man who sees all things in the same light. Above this is the state of that glorious light which is arrived by the disembodied soul. Those fortunate men, O Rama, who have arrived at the seventh stage of knowledge are those great minds who delight in the light of their souls and have reached their highest state of humanity. The living liberated are not plunged into the waters of pleasure and sorrow, but remain sedate and unmoved in both states. They are at liberty either to do so or to slight the discharge of their duties of their condition and positions in society. These men, being roused from their deep meditation by intruders, may assume their secular duties like men awakened from their slumber. Being ravished by the inner delights of their souls, they feel no pleasure in the delights of the world, just as men immersed in sound sleep can feel no delight at the dalliance of beauties about them. These seven stages of knowledge are known only to wise and thinking men, and not to beasts, brutes, or inert things all around us. They are unknown to barbarians and those who are barbarous in their minds and disposition. But anyone who has attained these states of knowledge, whether it be a beast or barbarian, an embodied being or disembodied spirit, has undoubtedly obtained its liberation. Knowledge severs the bonds of ignorance, and by loosening them produces the liberation of our souls. Knowledge is the sole cause of removing the fallacy of the appearance of water and the mirage and similar errors. Those who are freed from ignorance, but not yet arrived at their ultimate perfection of disembodied liberation, have secured the salvation of their souls by being placed in these stages of knowledge in their embodied state during their lifetime. Some have passed all these stages, and others 2 or 3 of them. Some have passed 6 grades, while few have attained the 7th state all at once. Some have gone over 3 stages, and others have attained the last. Some have passed 4 stages, and some no more than 1 or 2 of them. There are some who have advanced only a quarter or half or 3/4 of a stage. Some have passed over 4 quarters and a half, and some 6 1/2. Common people walking upon this earth know nothing regarding these passengers in the path of knowledge. They remained as blind as if their eyes were dazzled by some planetary light or eclipsed by its shadow. Wise men who stand victorious on these 7 grounds of knowledge are comparable to victorious kings. Celestial elephants are nothing before them, and mighty warriors must bend their heads before them. These great minds, who are victors on the grounds of knowledge, are worthy of veneration as conquerors of the enemies of their hearts and senses. They are entitled to the station above that of the emperor and an autocrat, both in this world and in the next in their embodied and disembodied liberation. Book 3, Chapter 119. Illustration of the Golden Ring, Form versus Substance. Vasistha said, the human soul, reflecting on its sense of ego, forgets its essence of the Supreme Soul, just as a gold ring, thinking of its round form, loses its thought of the gold substance of which it is made. Rama said, please tell me, sage, how can gold have consciousness of its form of a ring, like a soul is conscious of its sense of ego? Vasistha said, the consciousness of men relates only to their substance, and not the production and dissolution of their forms. So you should ask about the substance of the soul and gold, and not of ego and the ring, which are unsubstantial nothings in nature. When the jeweler sells his gold ring for the price of gold, he undoubtedly delivers the gold, which is the substance of the ring, and not the ring without its substance. Rama asked, if such is the case, that you take the gold for the ring, then what becomes of the ring as we commonly take it to be? Explain this to me, so that thereby I may know the substance of Brahman. Vasistha said, all form, O Rama, is formless, an accidental quality without any essential property. So if you would ascertain the nature of a non-existence, then tell me the shape and qualities of a barren woman's son. Do not fall into the error of taking the roundness of a ring as an essential property of it. The form of a thing is only apparent and not prominent to sight. Water in a mirage, 2 moons in the sky, men's sense of ego and the form of things, though appearing as real to sight and thought, cannot be proved as separate existence apart from their subjects. Again, the likeness of silver appears in oyster shells, but you cannot find even a particle of silver in the shell. An imprudent view of a thing makes nothing appear as real, like the appearance of silver in a shell or water in a mirage. The invalidity of nothing appears falsely as an existent entity to sight. The fallacy of a thing as something where there is nothing of the kind. Sometimes an unreal shadow acts the part of a real substance, such as a false apprehension of a ghost kills a lad from fear of being killed by it. After its form of jewelry is destroyed, there remains nothing in gold jewelry except gold. Therefore the forms of the ring and bracelet are no more than drops of oil or water on a heap of sand. The forms are absorbed in the substance, just as the fluid in the sand. There is nothing real or unreal on earth other than the false creation of our brain, and these, whether known as real or unreal, are equally productive of their consequence, like the sights and fears of ghosts and children. A thing, whether it is so or not, proves itself as it is believed to be by different kinds and minds of men. Poison becomes as effective as an elixir to the sick, and ambrosia proves as heinous as hemlock with the immoderate. Belief in only the essence of the soul constitutes true knowledge. Belief in individual ego and mind, as these are generally believed in the world, is ignorance. Therefore, abandon the thought of your false and unfounded sense of ego as individual existence. As there is no roundness of the ring inherent in gold, so there are no individual egos in all the pervading universal soul. There is nothing everlasting beside Brahman, and no personality of him as a Brahma, Vishnu, or any other. There is no substantive existence such as the world, only Brahma's offspring, called the patriarchs. There are no other worlds beside Brahma, nor is there any heaven without him. Hills, demons, mind and body all rest in that spirit, which is not any of these. He is no elementary principle, nor is he any material cause. He is none of the 3 times of past, present, and future, but all. He is not anything in being or not being. He is beyond your concept of individual ego, selfhood, and selfishness, and all your entities and non-entities. There is no attribution or particularity in he who is above all your ideas. He is none of the ideal personifications of your notions. He is the fullness of the world, supporting and moving all, being unmoved and unsupported by any. He is everlasting bliss without decay, having no name or symbol or cause of his own. He is no being, sat, that is born and existent, nor is he non-existent. He is neither the beginning, middle, or end of anything, but is all in all. He is unthinkable in the mind and unutterable by speech. He is vacuum about the emptiness and a bliss above all joy. Rama said, now I understand that Brahman is the same in all things. Yet I want to know, what is this creation that we see all about us? Vasistha replied, the Supreme Spirit being perfectly tranquil and all things being situated in him, it is wrong to speak of this creation or that when there is no such thing as a creation at any time. All things exist in the all-containing Spirit of God, just as the whole body of water is contained in the universal ocean. But there is fluctuation in the waters owing to their fluidity, whereas there is no motion in the quiet and motionless Spirit of God. The light of the luminary shines of itself, but not so the divine light. It is the nature of all lights to shine of themselves, but the light of Brahma is not visible to sight. As the waves of the ocean rise and fall in the body of its water, so these phenomena appear as concepts in the mind of God, as his ever-varying thoughts. To men of little understanding, these thoughts of the divine mind appear as realities. They think this sort of ideal creation will last for ages. Creation is determined to be thought of the divine mind. Creation is not anything different from the mind of God, just as the visible sky is nothing more than a part of infinity. The production and extinction of the world are mere thoughts of the divine mind, just as the formation and dissolution of ornaments take place in the same substance of gold. The mind that has obtained its calm composure views creation as full of the presence of God. Those who are led by their own convictions take the non-existent for reality, like children believing ghosts are real existences. The consciousness of individual ego causes the error of the objective knowledge of creation. The tranquil unconsciousness of ourselves brings us to the knowledge of the Supreme, who is above the objective and inert creation. These different created things appear in a different light to the wise who view them all in the unity of God, just as the intelligent well know that toy puppets or play soldiers are composed of mud and clay. This plenitude of the world is without beginning or end and appears like the faultless or perfect piece of workmanship. It is full with the fullness of the Supreme Being and remains full in the fullness of God. This fullness, which appears as the created world, is essentially the great Brahma and is situated in his greatness, just as the sky is situated in the sky, tranquility in tranquility, and joy in joy. Look at the reflection of a very long landscape in a mirror or a picture of a far-stretching city in a miniature, and you will find distances lost in their closeness. So the distances of worlds are lost in their proximity to one another in the Spirit of God. Some think of the world as a non-entity, and others as an entity by taking the world in different lights of being, a thing beside God or a reflection of Brahman. After all, it can have no real entity, being like the picture of a city and not the city itself. It is as false of an appearance as clear water in a desert mirage and that of a double moon in the sky. Magicians show magic cities in the air by sprinkling handfuls of dust before your eyes. In the same way, our false consciousness represents the unreal world as a reality. Unless our inborn ignorance, like an arbor or harmful plant, is burnt down to the very root by the flame of right reasoning, it will not cease to spread out its branches and grow the rankest weeds of our imaginary pleasures and sorrows. Book 3, Chapter 120. King Lavana visits the forest where he lived as a tribal. Lamentation of the woman tribal. Vasistha continued, Now Rama, listen to the wonderful power of air displayed in changing phenomena, like the changing forms of ornaments in the substance of the same gold. King Lavana, having perceived the falsehood of his vision at the end of his dream, resolved the following day to visit the great forest himself. He thought to himself, when shall I revisit the Vindhya region? It is inscribed in my mind, and I remember having undergone a great many hardships in my life there as a forester. So saying, he traveled south, accompanied by his ministers and attendants, as if he was going to make a conquest of that quarter. In a few days he arrived at the foot of the mountain. There he wandered about the southern, eastern, and western shores of the sea. He was as delighted as his round course of the luminary of the day in his daily journey from east to west. In a certain region he saw a deep and sorrowful forest stretching wide along his path, like the dark and dismal realm of death. Wandering in this region he saw everything he had seen in his dream. He inquired into former circumstance and wanted to learn whether they were the same as what he saw in his vision. He recognized the tribal hunters of his dream, and being curious to know the rest of the events, he continued in his wandering about the forest. Then he saw a hamlet at the edge of the wilderness, foggy with smoke and appearing like the place where he bore the name of Pushta, Pukusha, or cherished tribal. There he saw the same huts and hovels and the various kinds of human horses, fields, and plains, with the same men and women that dwelt there before. He saw the same landscapes and leafless branches of trees, shorn of their foliage by the all-devouring famine. He saw the same hunters pursuing their chase and the same helpless orphans lying around. He saw the old lady, his mother-in-law, wailing at the misfortune of the other woman, who were lamenting like her with their eyes drowned in tears at the untimely death and innumerable misery of their fellow brethren. The old matrons, with their eyes flowing with brilliant drops of tears, their bodies and bosoms emaciated under the pressure of their afflictions, were mourning with loud cries of sorrow in that dreary district stricken by drought and dearth. They cried, O you sons and daughters who lie dead with your emaciated bodies, for want of food for these 3 days, say where you have lives fled, stricken as they were by the steel of famine from the armor of your bodies. We remember your sweet smiles, showing your coral teeth resembling red gunjapalas to our lords as they descended from towering palm trees, with red ripe fruit held in their teeth, and growing on the cloud-capped mountain. When shall we again see the fierce leap of our children springing on wolves crouching in groves of kadamba, jam, lavanda, and gunja trees? Even in the face of Kama, the god of love, we do not see these graces that we used to see in the blue and black faces, the dark colors of spice leaves of our children when they feasted on their dainty food of fish and flesh. My blackish daughter, says one, the mother-in-law, has been snatched away from me with my dear husband like the dark Yamuna by the fierce Yama. Oh, they have been carried away from me like a tremendous gale blows a tamara tree branch with its clustering flowers from this woodland scene. O my daughter, with your necklace of the strings of red gunja seeds, gracing the firm breast of your youthful person, and your sweet swarthy complexion like the sea of ink gently shaken by the breeze. Ah, where have you fled with your clothing of woven withered leaves and your teeth as black as a jet jamba fruit? O young prince, who was as fair as the full moon, and did forsake the fairies of the harem, and who took so much delight in my daughter, where have you fled from us? Ah, my daughter, she too is dead in your absence, and fled from my presence. Being cast on the waves of this earthly ocean, and joined to the daughter of a tribal, you were, O prince, subjected to mean and vile employment that disgraced your princely character. Ah, that daughter of mine, with her trembling eyes like those of the timid fawn, oh, that husband, valiant as a royal tiger, you are both gone together, just as the high hopes and great efforts of men flee with the loss of their wealth. Now without a husband, and lately having also lost my daughter, and being thrown in a distant and barren land, I have become the most miserable and wretched of beings. Born of a low caste, I am cast out of all prospects in life. I have become a personification of terror to myself, and a sight of horror to others. Oh, that the Lord has made me a widowed woman, and subjected me to the insult of the vulgar and the snobbery of the affluent. Prostrated by hunger and mourning at the loss of the husband and child, I rove constantly from door to door, begging for alms for my support. It is better that one who is unfortunate and friendless, or subject to passion and disease, should die sooner than live in misery. Dead and inanimate beings are far better than living miserable. Those who are without friends and who have to toil and moil in unfriendly places are like the grass of the earth, trampled under feet and overwhelmed under the flood of disaster. The king, seeing his aged mother-in-law mourning in this manner, offered her some consolation through the medium of her female companions. Then he asked the lady to tell him, "Who are you? What do you do here? Who was your daughter, and who is your son?" She answered him with tears in her eyes, "This village is called Pukusha Gosha. Here I had a Pukasa for my husband, who had a daughter as gentle as a moon. She happened to have a husband beautiful as the moon, who was a king and chanced to pass by this way. By this accident they were matched together like an ass finding a chance a pot of honey lying on her way in the forest. She lived long with him in married bliss, and produced to him both sons and daughters, who grew up in this forest like a gourd plant grows on a tree, serving as its support." Book 3, Chapter 121. The reality of King Lavana's dream explained, proof of the futility of mind. The tribal continued, "O Lord of men, after lapse of some time there occurred a famine in this place, owing to the drought of rain, which broke down all men under its dire pressure. Pressed by extreme scarcity, all of our village people scattered far abroad, and they perished in famine, and they never returned. From then on, O Lord, we were exposed to utmost misery. We sit here lamenting in our helpless poverty. Behold us, Lord, all bathed in tears falling profusely from our never-drying eyelids." Vasistha speaking. At hearing these words from the mouth of the elderly lady, the king was lost in wonder. Looking at the face of his follower, the faithful minister, he remained in dumb amazement like a figure in a picture. He reflected repeatedly on the strange occurrence and its curious concurrence with his adventure in the dream. He made repeated queries relating to other circumstance. The more he heard and learned, the more he found their coincidence with the occurrence of his vision. He sympathized with their sorrows and saw them in the same state as he had seen them before in his dream. Then he gave suitable gifts and presents to relieve their wants and sorrows. He stayed there a long while and pondered on the decrees of destiny. Then the wheel of fortune brought him back to his house, where he entered amidst the loud cheers and low salutation of the citizens. In the morning the king appeared in his court hall, and sitting there amidst his courtiers, he asked, "How is it, O sage, that my dream has come to be verified in my presence to each item, and to my great surprise?" They answered me exactly and to the very point all that I had asked of them. They have removed the doubt in my mind of their truth, like winds disperse the clouds of heaven. Know this, O Rama, It is the illusion of ignorance, avidya, and this is the cause of great many errors. It makes the untruth appear as truth, and represents sober reality as unreality. Rama said, "Tell me, sage, how could the dream be verified? It is a mysterious account that cannot find a place in my understanding." Vasistha replied, "O Rama, everything is possible to the illusion of ignorance, which shows the fallacy of a picture in a pot. Illusion represents the actual occurrence of life as dreams, and dreams as realities. Distance appears to be near, as a distant mountain seen in a mirror. A long time seems a short interval, as in a night of undisturbed repose. What is untrue seems to be a truth, as in a dreaming one's own death in sleep. That which is impossible appears possible, as in flying in a dream. The stable seems unsteady, as in the false notion of the motion of fixed objects to one passing in a vehicle. The unmoving seems to be moving to one under the influence of his inebriation. The mind, infatuated by its interest, sees all that it thinks upon within itself as exposed to its view. It sees things in the same light as they are painted in his fancy, whether they exist or not, real or unreal. As soon as the mind contracts its ignorance by its false notion of I and you, it becomes subject to endless errors without beginning, middle, or end. It is notion that gives shape to all things. It makes a kalpa age appear as a moment, and it prolongs a moment of time to be a whole kalpa. A man deprived of understanding believes himself to have become a sheep, and a fighting ram thinks himself to be a lion in his ideal bravery. Ignorance causes the blunder of taking things for what they are not and falling into the errors of I and you. All errors in the mind produce errors in actions also. It is by mere accidents that men come into possession of the objects of their desire, and it is custom that determines the mode in mutual dealings. Lavana's memory of his dream living in with the tribals of Pukusha was the internal cause that represented to him the external picture of that place as if it were a reality. As the human mind is liable to forget many things that it had actually done, so it is susceptible to remember those acts as true which were never done but merely had been thought upon in the mind. In this manner, as long as I am thinking of having eaten something, it appears true to me, even though I am really fasting. The thought that I have been in a distant country in a dream appears true to me while I think the thought. That is how the king came to find the same conduct where the tribals lived by the Vindhya mountains. He had been impressed with its notion in his dream, as said before. Again, Lavana's false dream of the tribals took possession of their minds also. The notion of Lavana settled in his mind of the tribals, just like the thoughts of these people arose in the mind of the king. The same sentiment and figure of speech occur to different poets of distant ages and countries, so it should not be unexpected that the same thoughts and ideas should rise simultaneously in the minds of different men. In common experience we find notion and ideas stand for the things themselves, otherwise nothing is known to exist at all without our mind's notion or idea of it. One idea embraces many others under it, like those of waves and currents are contained under that of water, so one thought is associated by others relating its past, present, and future condition of being, just as the thought of a seed accompanies the thought of its past and future states, and its fruits and flowers of the trees. Nothing is an entity or a non-entity, and nothing can be said to exist or not exist unless we have a positive idea of its existence or a negative notion of its non-existence. All that we see in our air is as non-existent as oil and sand. In reality, the bracelet is nothing but a form of the substance of gold. A fallacy can have no connection with the reality, just as the fallacy of the world with the reality of the God, the fallacy of the ring with the substance of gold, and of the serpent with the rope. The connection or mutual relation of a thing of the same kind is quite evident in our mind. The relationship between gum resin and the tree is one of dissimilar union, and affords no distinct ideas except that the tree contains the gum. As all things are full of the Spirit, so we have distinct ideas of them in our minds. Minds are also spiritual substance. They are not like dull material stones which have no feelings. All things in the world are intellectually true and real. Therefore, we have their ideas impressed in our minds. There cannot be a relationship or connection between two dissimilar things which may be lasting but are never united together. Without such mutual relation of things, no idea of both can be formed together. Similar things being joined together form the wholeness of the same kind, presenting one form and different in nothing. Consciousness being joined with an abstract idea produces an invisible, inner, and uniform thought. Dull matter joined to another dull object forms a denser material object to view, but consciousness and material can never unite together owing to their different natures. The intellectual and material parts of a person can never be drawn together in any picture. The material picture lacks the intellectual part, which has consciousness and the power of knowledge. Intellectual beings do not take into account the different material things like wood and stone which combine for some useful purpose, such as building a house. The relationship between the tongue and taste is also homogeneous. Taste and the instrument of taste are both watery substances, and there is no heterogeneous relation between them. But there is no relation between consciousness and matter, like there is between stone and wood. Consciousness cannot combine with wood and stone to form anything. Spiritually considered, all things are alike because they are full of the same spirit. Otherwise, the error of distinction between the viewer and the view creates endless differences, like those between wood and stone and other things. The combination of unseen spirits is easily conceived because spirits can assume any form at one's pleasure and having no end. Know, you who seek truth, that all things are identical with the entity of God. Renounce your knowledge of non-entities and the various kinds of error and fallacies, and know the one is all. Consciousness is full with its knowledge, so there is nothing lacking in us. Consciousness presents us everything in its circumference, just like imagination in its wide range shows us the sites of the air-built castles and everything beside. To him there is no limit of time or place, but his presence extends over all his creation. Ignorance separates the Creator from creation and raises the errors of I and you. Forgetting the knowledge of the substance of gold, man contracts the error of taking it for the form of ornament. The mistake of jewelry for gold is like taking one thing for another and mistaking the production for the producer. The error of phenomena vanishes upon loss of its sight, and the difference among pieces of jewelry is lost in the substance of gold. The knowledge of unity removes that of a distinct creation, just as the knowledge of clay takes away the sense of toy soldiers made from it. The same Brahma causes the error of the reality of the exterior worlds, just as the underlying sea caused the error of waves on its surface. The same wood is mistaken for the carved figure, and common clay is mistaken for the pot made of it. Between sight and its object lies the eye of the beholder, which is beyond the sight of its viewer, and is neither the view nor the viewer. The mind traversing from one place to another leaves the body in between, which is neither moving nor quite unmoved, because only its mental part is in its moving state. Remain always in that quiet state which is not waking, dreaming, or sleeping, and which is not the state of consciousness or unconsciousness, but one of everlasting tranquility and rest. Drive away your dullness and remain always in the company of your sound intellect like a solid rock. Whether in joy or grief, commit your soul to your Maker. There is nothing to lose or earn in the world. Therefore remain in uniform bliss and joy, whether you think yourself to be blessed or unblessed in life. The soul residing in your body neither loves nor hates anything at any time. Therefore rest in quiet and fear nothing for what happens to your body. Do not engage your mind with the action of your body. Remain free from anxiety at the present, just as you are unconcerned about the future. Never be impelled by the impulses of your mind, but remain steadfast in your trust in the true God. Be unconcerned with all and remain as an absent man. Let your heart remain detached from everything like a block of stone or a toy made of wood. Look with the spiritual light of your soul, and see your mind as an inanimate thing. As there is no water in stone or fire in water, so the spiritual man has no mental action, nor does the divine spirit have any. If something unseen should ever come to do any action, that action is not attributed to the unseen agent, but to something else in the mind. The uncontrolled, selfish, unspiritual man who follows the dictates of his fickle and willful mind resembles a man on the border that's following the customs of outcasts or barbarians. Having disregarded the dictates of your vile mind, you may remain at ease and as fearless as an unconscious statue made of clay. He who understands that there is no such thing as the mind, or that he had one before but is dead in him today, becomes as immovable as a marble statue with this assurance in himself. There being no appearance of the mind in any case, and you having no such thing in you in reality except your soul, then say, why do you vainly infer its existence for your own error and harm? Those who vainly subject themselves to the false apparition of the mind are mostly men of unsound understanding, who bring destruction on themselves instead of the full moon of the pure soul. Remain firm as you are with yourself, soul, by casting your fancied and fanciful mind far away from you. Be free from the thoughts of the world by being settled in the thoughts of the Supreme Soul. They who follow a non-existence, such as the unreal mind, are like fools who shoot at the empty air and are cast into the shade. He who has cleansed off his mind is indeed a man of great understanding. He has gone across the air of the existence of the world and has become purified in his soul. We have considered long, and we have never found anything like the impure mind in the pure soul. Book 3, Chapter 122, Ascertainment of the Self or Soul. Vasistha said, after the birth of a man and a slight development of an understanding, he should associate with the company of good and wise men. Except by the light of Scriptures and association with the good and wise, there is no way to cross the river of ignorance that runs in its constant course, flowing in 1,000 streams. By reasoning, man is able to discern what is good for him and what he must avoid. Then he arrives to that ground of reason which is known as goodwill, or a desire to do what is good and keep from what is bad and evil. Then he is led by his reason to the power of reasoning, discerning truth from untruth and right from wrong. As he improves in knowledge, he gets rid of his improper desires and purifies his mind from all worldly cares. Then he is said to have gained the stage of knowledge which is called the purity of his soul and mind, and of his heart and conduct. When a yogi or adept attains full knowledge, he is said to have arrived at his state of goodness. By this means, in the curtailing of his desires, he arrives at the state called detachment, or indifference to all worldly matters, and he is no more subjected to the consequence of his actions. From the curtailment of desires, a yogi learns to withdraw his mind from the unrealities of the world. Whether sitting inactive in samadhi meditation, or doing anything for himself or others, he must fix his mind to whatever produces real good to the world. His soul, being cooled by the faintness of his desires, is habituated to do its duties without the knowledge of what it is doing. Truly, he who has subdued his mind has reached the contemplative stage of yoga meditation. Thus one who has had his mind dead in himself learns by practice of years to perform his duties in refraining from his thoughts of external objects. Such a one is said to have attained Turiya, or the 4th stage of spiritual elevation, and has become liberated in his lifetime. He is not glad to get anything or sorry to miss it. He lives without fear of accidents and is content with whatever he gets. O Rama, you have known whatever is to be known by man. You certainly have extinguished your desire in all your actions through life. Your thoughts are all spiritual and transcend the actions of the physical body, though you are in your embodied state. Do not give yourself to joy or grief, but know you are free from decay and defect. Spiritually, you are a pure and bright substance that is omnipresent, ubiquitous, and ever in its ascendancy, devoid of pleasure and pain, and of death and disease. Why do you lament at or a loss of a friend when you are so friendless in yourself? Being thrown alone in this world, whom do you claim as a friend of your soul? We see only the particles of matter of which this body is composed. It exists and passes away from its place in this time, but there is no rising or falling of the soul. Being imperishable in yourself, why do you fear to fall into nothing? We think of the destruction of your soul, which is never subject to death. When a jar is broken in two, its emptiness is not lost, but mixes with the air. The body being destroyed, the indestructible soul is not lost with it. As the sunlight that causes the appearance of a river in the mirage is not lost at the disappearance of the apparent river, so the immortal soul does not perish upon dissolution of the frail body. There is a certain illusion which raises false appetites within us. Otherwise, the unity of the soul requires the help of no duality or secondary substance in order to be united with the soul unity. There is no object of sense, whether visible, tangible, audible, or a taste or smelling, that can affect the unconnected soul. All things and their powers are contained in the all-powerful and all-comprehensive soul. These powers are displayed throughout the world, but the soul is as void as the empty air. O Raghava, mental deception presents the phenomena of the three worlds representing diverse forms according to the threefold nature or gunas of man. There are the three methods of dispelling this delusion of the mind, namely by the tranquility of the mind, by destroying its desire, and by abandonment of acts. The world is a crushing mill with its lower and upper stones of the earth and heavens. Our desires are the cords that constantly drag us under it. Therefore, Rama, break off these ropes. Our ignorance of spiritual knowledge is the cause of all our errors, but our acquaintance with it leads us to endless joy and ultimately to Brahman himself. A living being, having proceeded from Brahman and traveled over the earth at pleasure, in the end turns to Brahman through his knowledge of him. Rama, all things have sprung from one being who is perfect joy itself, inconceivable and without decay in its nature. All these things are like the rays of that light, or like the light of that everlasting fire. These are like lines of the leaves of trees, and like the curls and waves of the surface of the water. They are like ornaments made of that gold, and like the heat and cold of fire and water. Thus the three worlds exist in the thought of the divine mind. It is sprung from the mind of God, and it rests in the same state with the all-comprehending mind. This mind is called Brahma, who is the soul of all existence. He being known, the world is known also. As he is the knower of all, he gives us a knowledge of all things. This all-pervasive being is explained to us by the learned with labels like soul, intellect, and Brahma, used both in scripture and popular language. The pure notion that we have of an everlasting being apart from all ideas, from physical sense and impressions, is called consciousness and soul. This consciousness or intelligent soul is much more transparent than the ethereal sky. It is the fullness, it contains the plenitude of the world as a disjoined and distinct reflection of itself. The knowledge that the unreal reflection of world is a separate existence is the cause of all our ignorance and error, but the view of their existence in the mirror of the Supreme Soul blends them all to myself also. Now, Rama, you have a bodiless soul of the form of pure consciousness. You can have no cause to fall into the error of being sorry for or afraid of the vanities of the world. How can the unembodied soul be affected by the passion and feeling of the body? It is only the ignorant and unintelligent who are subject to vain suspicions about unrealities. Even the indestructible consciousness of the unintelligent is not destroyed by the destruction of their bodies. How then should the intelligent be afraid of their disillusion? Consciousness is irresistible in its course and roves about the solar path. It is the intellectual part that makes the man and not the outer body. The soul called the inner person, Purusha, whether it abides in the body or not, and whether it is intelligent or otherwise, never dies upon the death of the body. Whatever miseries you meet with in this transient world, they are all appertain to the body and not to the intangible soul or consciousness. The intellectual soul is removed from the region of the mind. It is not approached by the pleasure and pain affecting the body and mind. The soul that has curbed its earthly desire after the dissolution of its prison house of the body flies to its seat in the spirit of Brahman in the same manner as a bee lying hidden under the cover of lotus petals in the darkness of the light takes to its heavenward flight by the dawning light of the day. If life is known to be frail and the living state to be a transient scene, then say, O Rama, what is lost by the loss of this prison house of the body, and what is it that you mourn for? Think, therefore, O Rama, of the nature of truth and mind, and not about the errors of ignorance. Be free from your earthly desires, and know the sinless soul to be void of all desires. The intellectual soul, being tranquil and transparent, a mere witness of our doing, without any doings or desire of its own, receives the reflection of the God without desire, just as a mirror reflects the images of things. The soul being, as said before, a translucent particle, reflects the images of all worlds in itself, like a polished gem reflects the rays of light in its bosom. The relation between a detached soul and the world is like that of a mirror and its reflection. The difference and identity of the soul and the world are of the same kind. As the activities of living beings have a free play with the rising sun, so the duties of the world are fully discharged by the rising of consciousness. As soon as you get rid of your error of the substantiality of the world, you come to the consciousness of it being a vacuum resting in the Spirit of God. As the nature of a lighted lamp is to spread its light all around, so the nature of mental philosophy is to enlighten us with the real state of the soul. The essence of the Supreme Soul at first gives rise to the mind, will, which spreads out the universe with its network of endless varieties. It was like the sky issuing out the infinite emptiness and assigning the shape of a blue atmosphere, which is also a nothing. Removal of desire melts down the mind and dissolves the mist of ignorance from the face of consciousness. Then appears the bright light of the one infinite and uncreated God, like the clear sky of autumn after the cloud disperses. At first the mind grows out from the Supreme Soul with all its activities and takes the nature of the lotus-born Brahma by its desire of creation. It stretches out a variety of worlds by its creative will, like fancied apparitions appearing before the imagination of deluded children. Non-entity appears like an entity before us. It dies away at death and reappears with our new birth. The mind itself takes its rise from divine consciousness and displays itself in the substance of the divine soul, like waves playing on the surface of the waters of the deep. End of lesson. End of Book 3 on Creation, Utpatti Kanda.